Hello there and welcome. Before we begin our journey back in time to explore the lives of Victorian women, I want to take a moment to greet you wherever in the world you may be. Whether it's morning, afternoon, evening, or the witching hour, I'm so glad you've chosen to join me for some quiet, sleepy history. In fact, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the globe. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. And if you enjoy this type of soft, relaxing, historical storytelling, I invite you to subscribe so you can drift off to more bedtime tales of the past. Now, let's allow ourselves to sink deeper into relaxation as we set the scene. The year is 1837, and a young Queen Victoria has just ascended to the throne of England. The Victorian era has begun, ushering in a period of dramatic change, sweeping industrial progress and strict societal order. Over the next 64 years of Victoria's reign, the British Empire will reach its height, spanning a quarter of the globe. Innovation and invention will transform daily life at a dizzying pace. And yet, in this time of dizzying change, a woman's role remained rigidly defined and constrained. The life of a Victorian woman, from queen to pauper, was often one of hardship, repression, and shocking lack of agency. Over the next little while, as you rest and unwind, we'll explore the many complex facets of a Victorian woman's experience. We'll visit lavish manor houses and crowded city rooming houses, royal palaces, and gloomy brothels. We'll witness the quiet tragedy of thwarted ambitions and staggering maternal loss rates. But we'll also meet some extraordinary women who managed to rebel against the suffocating constraints of their era and fight for something better. So allow yourself to settle in, perhaps resting your eyes if you feel so called. Let the sounds of the modern world fade away as we travel back together to the gaslit streets, foggy moors, and grand brick facades of Victorian England. And let us begin by stepping into the most central aspect of a Victorian woman's identity, the hallowed sphere of the home. To properly set the scene, we need to understand that a Victorian woman's world was strictly divided between public and private, and a lady's proper place was firmly in the domestic realm. As author and critic John Ruskin famously declared in 1865, men and women were designed for separate spheres based on their inherently different natures. In his lecture of Queen's Gardens, Ruskin celebrated the home as a woman's rightful domain. The woman's power is for rule, not for battle, and her intellect is not for invention or creation, but for sweet ordering, arrangement, and decision. She sees the qualities of things, their claims, and their places. Her great function is praise. She enters into no contest, but infallibly adjudges the crown of contest. By her office and place, she is protected from all danger and temptation. The man, in his rough work in open world, must encounter all peril and trial. But he guards the woman from all this, within his house, as ruled by her. This ideal of separate spheres was held up as the pinnacle of civilized society, and it defined a Victorian woman's entire existence. From the moment a girl child of the middle or upper classes was born, she was groomed for a life of domestic pursuits. She was educated not to expand her mind, but to mould her into the perfect angel in the house, the term coined by poet Coventry Patmore in praise of his meek, devoted, selfless wife Emily. An angelic household paragon was expected to blissfully submit to her husband's authority while flawlessly overseeing every aspect of home life. Managing cleaning, cooking, social engagements, the instruction of children, household accounts, and a full staff of servants was no easy feat in an era without modern conveniences. A lady's work may have been centered around soft furnishings, fine china, and burbling tea kettles, but it was physically and mentally taxing labor all the same. Perhaps no one captured the sheer complexity of a Victorian housewife's duties better than Mrs. Isabella Beeton, whose seminal 1861 domestic guide, Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, became the indispensable Bible of the 19th century homemaker. Room by room and task by task, Mrs. Beeton scrupulously detailed the proper management of a Victorian home, from the slaughtering of livestock to the seasoning of soup to the weekly cleaning rota. Hers was an exacting, exhausting standard of household perfection. And yet, what few of Mrs. Beeton's devoted readers realized was that Isabella herself was often far too ill to personally live up to her own demanding ideals. Plagued by debilitating chronic disease after contracting syphilis from her philandering husband on their wedding night, Mrs. Beeton completed her domestic advice opus at the tender age of 23, only to die at 28, weakened by constant pregnancies and the unrelenting pressures of Victorian womanhood. The very avatar of selfless feminine domesticity had herself been ground down and destroyed by the impossible expectations placed upon her. Within the so-called sanctuary of the home, a Victorian woman had power, but she paid dearly for it. She worked her fingers to the bone to run her household while remaining ever smiling, ever charming, ever ready to soothe and please. The home may have been her refuge, but it was also her gilded cage. And yet for many well-to-do Victorian women, even this dubious domestic authority came at a steep price, one often paid on the marriage market. Continue developing the outline. As we've seen, life for women in Victorian England was marked by countless constraints and challenges. But there were some who dared to push back against society's rigid expectations in ways both big and small. One such woman was Florence Nightingale, whose journey to become a nurse was far from easy. Born into a life of wealth and privilege in 1820, the young Florence had little interest in the endless rounds of balls and social calls expected of a woman of her class. Instead, she found herself drawn to the idea of serving others through nursing, a most unladylike profession at the time. Her family was appalled when Florence announced her intentions. Nursing was seen as a lowly occupation, suitable only for working-class women, not a respectable lady like their Florence. But Florence would not be swayed. She had found her calling and was determined to answer it no matter the cost. In 1844, over the strong objections of her mother and sister, Florence enrolled as a nursing student at the Lutheran Hospital of Pastor Fleidner in Germany. It was a bold, nearly unheard of move for a young woman of her background. After completing her training, Florence returned to London, ready to put her skills to use. But she faced resistance at every turn. The doctors and male administrators at the hospitals where she worked doubted her competence and resented taking orders from a woman. Some even refused outright to work with her. Still, Florence persevered. Her defining moment came during the Crimean War. With reports streaming in of appalling conditions and high mortality rates at the military hospital in Scutari, Florence assembled a team of nurses and set out for Turkey. What she found there was even worse than she had feared. Filthy, overcrowded wards crawling with rats, contaminated water, and rampant disease. Undaunted, Florence set to work. She procured fresh food and clean linens, established a laundry and kitchen, and instituted strict sanitary protocols. She made rounds at all hours, tending to patients and raising morale. Her tireless efforts paid off. In mere months, the hospital's mortality rate dropped from over 40% to just 2%. Florence's successes in Crimea made her a national hero. She became known as the Lady with the Lamp for her habit of making night rounds, and her name was spoken with reverence in households across England. Perhaps more importantly, she had single-handedly transformed the public image of nursing. No longer seen as a vocation of last resort, it was fast becoming a respected profession for dedicated women. Florence leveraged her newfound celebrity to continue advocating for healthcare reform, She established the Nightingale Home and Training School for Nurses in London, where she pioneered a rigorous curriculum emphasizing patient observation, hygiene, and care techniques that are still taught today. Her book, Notes on Nursing, published in 1859, became a classic text. Though she spent the last several decades of her life as an invalid, Florence never stopped working. She wrote prolifically, using statistics to lobby for public health measures like improved sanitation and nutrition. In 1907, she became the first woman to receive the Order of Merit, Britain's highest civilian honour. When Florence Nightingale died in 1910 at the age of 90, she had long since cemented her place in history. She had defied every convention and limitation placed on Victorian women to forge her own path and leave an indelible mark. Her courage and tenacity opened doors for the generations of women who would follow in her footsteps. Florence's story is a powerful reminder that even in the face of immense societal pressure, it's possible to make a difference. She refused to accept the domestic fate prescribed for women of her time, instead insisting on purpose and impact. While she was far from the only woman fighting for change in the Victorian era, her success was pivotal in changing attitudes and chipping away at the rigid gender norms. Of course, Florence's achievements, extraordinary as they were, did not erase the many hardships faced by women of her time. For every pioneering nurse or activist, there were countless others still toiling in obscurity, their dreams and ambitions thwarted. The vast majority, regardless of class, still had very little control over their own lives and destinies. It would take many more decades of tireless efforts by brave women like Florence Nightingale to shift the balance and secure the rights and freedoms we enjoy today. But each of their stories added crucial momentum to the slow, steady march of progress. Each defiant act, each boundary pushed, brought society that much closer to a world of true equality. So while the Victorian era was unquestionably brutal in many ways for women, it also planted the seeds of change. The first women's colleges were established, laws around divorce and married women's property rights began to loosen. By the end of the 19th century, the first women's suffrage bills were being presented to Parliament. The notion that women might have a life outside of marriage and motherhood was no longer quite so unthinkable. None of this progress would have been possible without the courage and determination of women like Florence Nightingale. Women who were willing to endure ridicule, resistance, and worse, to stand up for their beliefs. Women who refused to be silenced or sidelined, who insisted on having a voice. As we've seen, that voice was often hard-won. For much of the Victorian era, the ideal woman was still expected to be demure, domestic, and submissive. She was to be a dutiful wife, a devoted mother, and a gracious hostess, never a boat rocker or rabble-rouser. To step outside that narrowly prescribed role was to court scandal and ostracism. But step outside they did. Through their words, their deeds, and their sheer force of will, the rebellious women of the Victorian era chipped away at the prevailing wisdom of what a woman could and should be. In so doing, they paved the way for the even more expansive victories to come in the 20th century and beyond. We still have a long way to go, of course. True gender equality remains an elusive goal even today, but as we drift off to sleep, let us spare a moment of gratitude for those who came before, who dreamed that dream and fought that fight in the face of such daunting odds. The world we now inhabit would have been unimaginable to most Victorian women. The fact that it isn't is thanks to visionaries and trailblazers like Florence Nightingale, who refused to let their horizons be limited by the expectations of their time. May we all be emboldened by their example to continue reaching for a better, brighter, more equitable future, no matter the resistance we face. Because if the women of the Victorian era taught us anything, it's that change is possible, even against the steepest odds. that the status quo, no matter how entrenched, is not immutable, and that with enough grit and determination, a single voice can echo across generations, quietly at first, but with the power to reshape the world. The plight of Victorian women in the marriage market is perhaps best illustrated through the experiences and writings of Anne Thackeray and Mary Ann Evans, who came of age in the early Victorian era. Both women were considered ugly ducklings, plain, bookish, and decidedly unfit for the ruthless marriage market that dominated society at the time. As the daughters of genteel but not wealthy families, they were expected to marry, and to marry well, in order to secure their futures and those of their families. But without beauty, charm, or fortune, their prospects were bleak. Anne Thackeray, the eldest daughter of famed novelist William Makepeace Thackeray, was a shy, awkward girl who struggled to conform to the strict expectations of femininity. In her semi-autobiographical novel, The Story of Elizabeth, she sketches a painful portrait of a young woman navigating the perils of courtship and the marriage market. The novel's heroine, Elizabeth, is plain, poor, and socially inept, a clear stand-in for Anne herself. Through Elizabeth's eyes, we see the humiliating rituals of balls and social calls, the constant jockeying for position, the whispered gossip behind fans. We feel the acute pressure on women to perform femininity and secure a husband, no matter the cost to their dignity or well-being. Mary Ann Evans, who would later achieve fame as the novelist George Eliot, faced similar struggles as a young woman. Like Anne Thackeray, she was intelligent and ambitious, with little patience for the frivolities of courtship. She was also, by her own admission, magnificently ugly, deliciously hideous, in an era when a woman's worth was measured by her appearance and marriageability. Mary Ann's prospects were grim. As she wryly observed in a letter to a friend, "I have the misfortune of being a woman and unmarriageable because of my plain face." For both Anne Thackeray and Mary Ann Evans, the marriage market was a source of acute pain and frustration. They chafed against the limitations placed on women, the stifling expectations of femininity, the lack of alternatives to marriage. In their writings, they exposed the ugly underbelly of courtship and marriage in Victorian society, the transactional nature of it all, the cold calculations of status and fortune, the impossibility of true love or companionship. And yet, both women ultimately defied the constraints of their era to forge their own paths. Anne Thackeray never married, but she found fulfillment as a writer, publishing several popular novels and supporting herself and her family through her literary efforts. Mary Ann Evans, too, bucked convention to pursue her intellectual ambitions. She moved to London, adopted a masculine pen name, and became one of the most celebrated novelists of her time. In their own ways, Anne Thackeray and Mary Ann Evans resisted the brutal expectations placed on Victorian women in the marriage market. Through their writings and their lives, they challenged the notion that a woman's worth lay solely in her ability to secure a husband. They offered a glimpse of a different path, one where women could be valued for their minds and their talents, not just their marriageability. And while their individual rebellions were small and quiet in the face of such an entrenched system, they nonetheless helped to chip away at the edifice of patriarchy, one witty observation and one best-selling book at a time. Their stories serve as a reminder of just how few options were available to even privileged Victorian women when it came to securing their futures. Without beauty, wealth, or social connections, women like Anne Thackeray and Mary Ann Evans were at the mercy of a system that saw them as little more than commodities to be traded on the marriage market. And yet, through their determination and their gifts, they were able to imagine a different kind of life for themselves and for future generations of women. Sadly, even as some women were beginning to push back against the limits placed on them, Victorian society found new ways to constrain and control the female body and mind. One of the most insidious of these was the diagnosis of hysteria, a catch-all term for any kind of female malady or misbehavior. Under the banner of hysteria, Victorian women's physical and mental health complaints were routinely dismissed, belittled, or even used as justification for drastic medical interventions. The roots of hysteria as a female disorder can be traced back to ancient Greece, where it was believed that the womb could wander around the body, causing all manner of distress. This idea persisted into the Victorian era, with physicians continuing to view women's reproductive organs as the source of a host of ailments. Any outburst of emotion, any deviation from demure femininity, any physical complaint that could not be easily diagnosed was chalked up to hysteria, a disturbance of the wandering womb. For Victorian women, the consequences of a hysteria diagnosis could be severe. At best, they might be prescribed rest cures, confinement to bed for weeks or months on end. At worst, they could be subjected to dangerous and destructive treatments, from purging and bleeding to cauterization of the genitals. Many women were committed to asylums for hysteria, their freedom and autonomy stripped away in the name of controlling their unruly female bodies. The case of Nanny Rhines offers a chilling glimpse into the ways hysteria was weaponized against women in Victorian society. Nanny, a lively young woman from a wealthy southern family, began to experience mysterious symptoms in her late teens: fatigue, headaches, fainting spells. Her concerned parents sent her to a series of doctors, all of whom diagnosed her with hysteria and prescribed various ineffectual treatments. As Nanny's condition worsened, her behavior became more erratic. She lashed out at her family, refused to eat or sleep, and claimed to be possessed by demons. Desperate for a cure, Nanny's parents committed her to the care of Dr. Isaac Baker Brown, a noted gynecological surgeon with a reputation for treating hysteria. Dr. Brown promptly diagnosed Nanny with hysteroepilepsy, a form of hysteria characterized by seizures and sexual mania. His prescribed treatment was clitoridectomy, the surgical removal of the clitoris. Nanny, like so many other women subjected to such barbaric cures, was left physically and emotionally scarred by her ordeal. She spent months recovering from the surgery, only to be told that her hysteria persisted. She was eventually committed to an asylum, where she spent the rest of her days in a state of quiet despair, her once vibrant spirit broken by the cruelties inflicted upon her in the name of medicine. Nanny's story is a stark reminder of the ways in which Victorian society pathologized and controlled women's bodies and minds. Under the guise of hysteria, any expression of female agency or distress could be ruthlessly suppressed. Women like Nanny were subjected to painful, humiliating procedures and stripped of their autonomy, all in the service of maintaining a narrow ideal of docile femininity. And yet, even as some Victorian women were being diagnosed with and treated for hysteria, others were beginning to push back against the medical establishment's mistreatment of women. Among them was Mary Putnam Jacobi, one of the first female physicians in the United States. Jacobi, who studied medicine in Paris and New York, was a vocal critic of the hysteria diagnosis and its use as a tool of oppression against women. In her groundbreaking work, The Question of Rest for Women During Menstruation, Jacobi challenged the prevailing belief that women were inherently weak and sickly due to their reproductive systems. Through meticulous research and statistical analysis, she demonstrated that menstruation was a normal, healthy process that did not require rest or medical intervention. She also argued that the hysteria diagnosis was a catch-all term used to dismiss and control women, rather than a legitimate medical condition. Jacobi's work, though controversial at the time, helped to chip away at the edifice of hysteria and the broader medicalization of women's bodies in Victorian society. She offered a vision of women as strong, capable, and in control of their own health and destinies. And while the hysteria diagnosis would persist well into the 20th century, Jacobi and other pioneering female physicians helped to lay the groundwork for a more enlightened an empowering approach to women's healthcare. As we've seen, the Victorian era was a time of immense challenges and constraints for women, from the stifling domestic sphere to the perils of the marriage market to the medicalization of their bodies and minds. But even in the face of such oppression, there were glimmers of hope and resistance. Women like Mary Putnam Jacobi, Mary Ann Evans, and Anne Thackeray found ways to defy the expectations placed upon them and carve out new paths for themselves and for future generations. And as the Victorian era drew to a close, the seeds of change that had been planted by these pioneering women began to bear fruit. The fight for women's suffrage, for access to education and professional opportunities, for bodily autonomy and freedom from male control would continue on into the 20th century and beyond. But the groundwork had been laid by the Victorian women who refused to accept the status quo, who pushed back against the constraints placed upon them, and who dared to imagine a different kind of world. As we reflect on the lives of Victorian women from the comfort of our modern vantage point, it's easy to feel a sense of relief and gratitude for how far we've come. We no longer live in a world where women are barred from universities, diagnosed with hysteria for expressing emotion, or bought and sold on the marriage market like chattel. And yet, the echoes of the Victorian era still reverberate in our own time. Women continue to face discrimination, harassment, and violence simply for being women. The beauty standards that tyrannize Victorian women may have shifted, but the pressure on women to conform to narrow ideals of femininity remains intense. And while women have made great strides in politics, business, and other male-dominated spheres, the playing field is still far from level. Perhaps then, the most enduring legacy of the Victorian women we've encountered is the spirit of resilience and resistance they embodied in the face of unimaginable odds. From Caroline Norton's fierce advocacy for married women's rights to Florence Nightingale's trailblazing work in nursing, to the quiet rebellions of Anne Thackeray and Mary Ann Evans against the marriage market, these women refused to accept the limitations placed upon them by society. They fought back in ways big and small against the forces that sought to control and diminish them. In doing so, they lit a flame that continues to burn today, a flame of hope, of defiance, of the unshakable conviction that a better world is possible. As we navigate the challenges and constraints of our own time, we can draw strength and inspiration from the Victorian women who came before us. We can honor their legacy by continuing to push back against oppression in all its forms, by refusing to be silenced or sidelined, by daring to imagine a world in which every woman can thrive and flourish on her own terms. The road ahead is long, and the obstacles are many. But as we look back on the lives of Victorian women, we are reminded that progress is possible, that change can happen, that even the most entrenched systems of power can be disrupted and transformed. And so we press on, in solidarity with our foremothers, and in hope for a brighter, more equitable future for all. As we come to the end of our journey through the world of Victorian women, we are left with a sense of awe at their resilience, their courage, and their unwavering determination in the face of unimaginable odds. From the suffocating confines of the domestic sphere to the brutal realities of the marriage market, to the medicalization and control of their bodies and minds, Victorian women faced a staggering array of challenges and constraints. And yet, as we've seen, they refused to be silenced or subdued. They found ways, big and small, to resist the forces that sought to control them. Through their writings, their advocacy, their quiet acts of rebellion, they laid the groundwork for the feminist movements that would emerge in the 20th century and beyond, chipping away at the edifice of patriarchy, one book, one speech, one act of defiance at a time. As we reflect on their legacy, it's easy to feel a sense of gratitude for the progress we've made since the Victorian era. Women today have access to education, professional opportunities, and legal rights that would have been unimaginable to our foremothers. We can vote, own property, control our own bodies and destinies in ways that Victorian women could only dream of. And yet, the fight for true gender equality is far from over. Women continue to face discrimination, harassment, and violence in every sphere of life. The beauty standards and expectations of femininity that tyrannized Victorian women may have shifted in form, but they remain just as powerful and oppressive today. And while women have made great strides in breaking into male-dominated fields, the glass ceiling remains stubbornly intact. Perhaps then, the most important lesson we can take from the lives of Victorian women is the need for ongoing vigilance and resistance in the face of oppression. As the saying goes, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. And that is just as true in the fight for women's rights as it is in any other struggle for justice and equality. So let us honour the legacy of the Victorian women who came before us by continuing to push back against the forces that seek to diminish and control us. Let us take inspiration from their courage, their resilience, and their unwavering belief in a better world. Let us refuse to be silenced or sidelined, and instead use our voices and our talents to advocate for change. And let us never forget the sacrifices and struggles of the women who paved the way for us. The trailblazers and rebels, the writers and activists, the everyday heroines who refused to accept the limitations placed upon them by society. Their stories may have been lost to history, their names may have been forgotten, but their spirits live on in every woman who dares to dream of a world in which she can be truly free. As we close this chapter on the lives of Victorian women, let us carry their legacy forward into the future. Let us continue to fight for a world in which every woman can thrive and flourish on her own terms, free from the constraints of gender, class, and oppression. Let us build upon the progress they made and tear down the barriers that still remain. And let us never, ever give up on the dream of a truly equal and just society for all. The road ahead may be long and the challenges may be great, but we stand on the shoulders of giants, the brave and brilliant women who came before us and showed us the way. With their example to guide us and their spirit to inspire us, there is no limit to what we can achieve. So let us press on in solidarity and in hope towards a brighter, more beautiful future for us all. The Victorian era represented the pinnacle of Britain's power and prestige on the world stage, driven by the transformative effects of industrialisation, global trade, and a vast colonial empire. Yet beneath the prim and proper veneer of Victorian society, with its strict moral code and grandiose ambitions, life for women in this era was often defined by suffocating constraints, limited opportunities, and harsh daily realities. From the stifling confines of the domestic sphere to the disfiguring effects of oppressive fashions, the brutal conditions faced by working-class women to the total legal subjugation of wives, Victorian women across all walks of life found themselves trapped in a world that demanded everything of them while granting them precious little in return. Even the most basic rights to their own children, their own earnings, their own bodies were routinely denied to them by a staunchly patriarchal society determined to keep them in a subordinate position. Yet even in the face of such unrelenting opposition, the indomitable spirit of Victorian womanhood could not be completely contained. Through their writings, their activism, their sheer determination, remarkable women in this era fought to expand the sphere of what was possible and lay the groundwork for the slow dismantling of the very system that oppressed them. One of the first and most fundamental ways that Victorian society kept women in a subservient position was by restricting them to a strictly limited sphere of influence within the home. The prevailing ideology of separate spheres dictated that a woman's domain was solely the domestic realm, while men enjoyed free rein in the wider world of business, politics, and public life. A woman's primary duties were to manage the household and raise the children, providing a refuge of domestic tranquility for her husband to return to at the end of the day. From the moment they awoke until they retired for the night, Victorian women were expected to devote themselves wholly to these all-consuming responsibilities, suppressing any hint of their own needs or desires in the process. Though this confinement to a life of domesticity was often framed as the natural and divinely ordained role for women, the reality was anything but idyllic. The daily demands of running a household in the Victorian era required backbreaking physical labour, without any of the modern conveniences that would later ease this burden. Every surface in the house demanded constant polishing, dusting, and scouring to maintain the immaculate appearance necessary to project an image of respectable gentility. Mountains of laundry had to be soaked, scrubbed, wrung out, and pressed, using nothing more than washboards, heavy irons, and elbow grease. And all of this was to be carried out while wearing long, restrictive dresses and tight corsets that made even the simple act of breathing a chore. For women of the growing middle class, eager to prove their rising social status, the pressures and drudgery of household management were compounded by the need to project an image of effortless grace and refinement. Not only did they face the physically taxing work of constant cleaning and child rearing, but they were also expected to serve as impeccable hostesses and social planners, orchestrating elaborate dinners, teas, and entertainments for their husbands' professional contacts. Managing a team of household servants was a job in and of itself, requiring a woman to serve as the public face of the household while also privately handling crises ranging from insubordinate maids to lecherous footmen. A wife's ability to cultivate an image of domestic bliss and social affability was critical to supporting her husband's career ambitions and ensuring the family's continued climb up the social ladder. Few women embodied the feminine ideal of the angel in the house, quite like Isabella Beeton, whose 1861 guide, Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, served as an exhaustive manual and Bible for Victorian housewives. A paragon of selfless service and wifely devotion, Mrs. Beeton offered painstakingly detailed advice on everything from removing stubborn stains to folding the perfect napkin to crafting a dinner menu that would suitably impress influential guests. What readers of her celebrated guide didn't know was that behind her public image of cheery capability, Mrs. Beeton's own life was marred by tragedy and illness. Having contracted syphilis from her philandering husband on her honeymoon, she suffered through multiple miscarriages and stillbirths before dying at the age of just 28. Even as she was dispensing authoritative guidance to women across England about the hallmarks of sound household management, Mrs. Beeton was secretly grappling with the physical and emotional toll of her own personal hardships. Her story exemplified both the impossibly high standards Victorian society set for women and the grim realities lurking beneath the surface of even the most seemingly picture-perfect household. As if the sheer drudgery and unceasing demands of housework weren't taxing enough, Victorian women were further burdened by the oppressive dictates of fashion. The Victorian era marked the apotheosis of a certain kind of exaggerated femininity, characterized by almost cartoonishly tiny waists, delicate fainting spells, and a carefully cultivated air of childlike fragility. Perversely, the physical weakness imposed on women by the fashions of the day was taken as proof of their inherent unsuitability for anything beyond a life of passive domesticity. A proper lady was expected to look as if the slightest breeze might bowl her over, her frail constitution and utter helplessness serving as an intoxicating invitation for men to act as her protectors and saviors. The epitome of this feminine ideal was the corset, a rigid, tightly laced undergarment designed to dramatically cinch the waist and thrust the bosom upwards. Constructed from sturdy cotton or even inflexible steel, corsets restricted women's movement and made it difficult to breathe deeply, eat heartily, or engage in any strenuous activity. Fainting, headaches, and digestive ailments were common side effects, as women's internal organs were mercilessly compressed in the quest for the perfect hourglass figure. Long-term health consequences could be even more severe, with the sustained pressure of corsets blamed for misshapen ribs, weakened abdominal muscles, and even the displacement of the liver. Yet no proper woman would dream of appearing in public, or even relaxing in her own home without being fully corseted. Not only would an uncorseted figure be deemed unsightly and unladylike, but it might also invite scandalous speculation about moral looseness and lack of breeding. The crushing pressure of corsets served as an apt metaphor for the constrained position of women in Victorian society as a whole. On top of their strangling undergarments, women were further weighed down by layer upon layer of heavy, cumbersome garments. A fashionable daytime ensemble could easily include a chemise, drawers, corset cover, crinoline or bustle cage, petticoats, bodice and skirt, topped off with outerwear like jackets, capes and shawls as needed. Simply getting dressed each morning with the assistance of a lady's maid could take well over an hour and leave a woman feeling exhausted before the day had even properly begun. These impractical fashions imposed limitations on women's freedom of movement that went beyond the simply physical. With her mobility severely curtailed by voluminous skirts and tottering heels, a Victorian lady's ability to navigate public spaces on her own was greatly impeded. Merely trying to board a carriage or climb a flight of stairs became a perilous ordeal that required male assistance, reinforcing notions of female dependency and helplessness. For all the discomforts and indignities that fashionable dress inflicted on Victorian women, it did grant them one dubious privilege: the ability to display their family's wealth and social standing for all the world to see. In an era when a woman's value was largely determined by her marriageability, and her marriageability hinged on the social connections and economic resources she could bring to the match, the ability to conspicuously demonstrate her worth through her attire was no small matter. The highest ranks of Victorian society engaged in an endless game of sartorial one-upmanship, each new fashion season bringing fresh opportunities to showcase one's superior taste and virtually unlimited budget. Dresses were confections of sumptuous fabrics like silk, satin, and velvet, lavishly embellished with ruffles, flounces, lace, and fringe. A particularly well-heeled lady might think nothing of spending a sum equivalent to a clerk's annual wages on a single gown for an important social occasion. Of course, keeping up such appearances was a full-time occupation in itself, demanding an army of specialized assistants, including ladies' maids, hairdressers, milliners, dressmakers, and fashion advisors. Woe betide the woman who failed to keep up with the whims of fashion or dared to be seen wearing the same dress twice in one season. Whispers and side-eyes from her social circle were sure to follow. For women of more modest means, the costly demands of fashionable dress could be a source of unending anxiety and self-denial. A middle-class housewife might scrimp and save for months to afford a single new gown, knowing that her family's social ambitions rested on her ability to maintain a respectable appearance. Women who couldn't afford to hire help were faced with the unenviable task of laundering and mending these complex garments on their own, a painstaking chore that only added to their domestic burdens. The rigid standards of Victorian beauty went beyond exaggerated hourglass figures and impractical frocks to encompass every aspect of a woman's deportment and appearance. At a time when a clear peaches and cream complexion was taken as a sign of refinement and delicacy, many women went to dangerous lengths to achieve an ivory pallor. Although Queen Victoria publicly declared the use of cosmetics vulgar, and by extension implied they were the province of actresses and prostitutes, a roaring trade nonetheless existed in lead-based face powders, mercury-laden skin lighteners, and arsenic complexion wafers. Ironically, the very cosmetic products women turned to in pursuit of an alabaster glow often contained toxic ingredients that ate away at their skin and caused tooth loss, hair loss, and a host of other health problems. Perhaps no one better embodied the perils of trying to live up to an impossible standard of beauty than Empress Elizabeth of Austria. Famed across Europe for her thick, floor-length chestnut hair, slim build, and finely chiseled features, Sissi was resented by her mother-in-law for being too beautiful to be an empress. In her quest to maintain an eternally youthful, slender appearance, Sissi devoted several hours each day to her beauty regimen, undergoing lengthy massages and hair grooming sessions, performing rigorous exercise routines, and subsisting on a near-starvation diet. As she aged, she became increasingly reclusive and anxious, demanding that no mirrors be placed in her chambers and refusing to have any portraits painted of her. Although Sissi was celebrated as the ultimate icon of aristocratic refinement and feminine beauty, in truth her life was a chronicle of thwarted ambitions, family tragedies, and intense physical and emotional strain. In trying to mold herself into an ornamental showpiece whose value lay entirely in her looks, she found herself trapped in a gilded cage of her own making, forever chasing after an image of perfection that left no room for her humanity. The streets of Victorian London bustled with life. Horse-drawn carriages clattered over cobblestones, newspaper boys shouted the latest headlines, and bewhiskered gentlemen in top hats strode past with canes in hand. But amidst the sights and sounds of this rapidly modernizing city, one half of the population remained tucked away behind closed doors, their voices muffled and their troubles unseen. For women in Victorian England, life was a series of harsh constraints and heavy expectations, their worlds confined to the domestic sphere. A proper Victorian lady's sole purpose was to be an angel in the house, a virtuous, submissive wife and mother whose life revolved around the home. From the moment she awoke until she drifted off to sleep, her day was filled with a never-ending litany of household duties. She oversaw the kitchen and the cooking, ensuring that meals were prepared promptly and to her husband's liking. She directed a staff of servants, managing their work with a firm but ladylike hand. And she laboured over the mending and sewing, her nimble fingers stitching by candlelight, late into the night. But the work of the Victorian housewife was not merely physical, it was also social and emotional. A woman was expected to be the beating heart of the home, creating a warm and welcoming environment for her family. She planned dinner parties and tea socials, spending hours carefully crafting guest lists and menus that would reflect well upon her husband's status. She fretted over the children's moral upbringing, their education, and their prospects, knowing that their futures rested heavily on her shoulders. It was an exhausting existence, one that left little room for personal fulfillment or self-care. But there was one Victorian woman who seemed to have it all figured out, Mrs. Isabella Beeton, the Martha Stewart of her day. Born in 1836, Isabella was a curious and intelligent child who loved to read and write. She married a wealthy publisher named Samuel Beeton when she was just 20 years old, and soon found herself thrust into the role of Victorian housewife. But rather than buckling under the pressure, Isabella thrived. She threw herself into learning everything she could about cooking, cleaning, and household management, and began writing articles for her husband's magazines, sharing her knowledge with other women. In 1861, at the tender age of 25, she published her masterwork, Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management. The book was a sensation, selling over 60,000 copies in its first year alone. It contained over 900 recipes, as well as detailed instructions on everything from budgeting to childcare to the proper way to fold a napkin. For Victorian women, it was a lifeline, a guide to help them navigate the complex and often contradictory expectations placed upon them. But what readers didn't know was that behind Mrs. Beeton's perfect facade lay a woman struggling with chronic illness. Isabella suffered from debilitating migraines and digestive issues, and was frequently bedridden for days at a time. She wrote much of her famous book while in constant pain, propped up on pillows with a writing desk across her knees. In many ways, Isabella's story encapsulates the plight of the Victorian woman. Outwardly poised and capable, but inwardly strained under the weight of societal pressure. The expectations placed on women were not just confining, but often physically harmful. The cult of ideal womanhood demanded that ladies maintain a delicate, fragile beauty, their figures molded by whalebone corsets and layers upon layers of heavy fabric. The ideal Victorian silhouette was an exaggerated hourglass with a tiny wasp waist that could only be achieved through tight lacing. Women cinched their corsets tighter and tighter, sometimes even removing ribs to achieve the desired shape. The consequences were disastrous for their health: compressed organs, restricted breathing, and even deformities of the skeleton. But to be fashionable was a woman's duty, and to neglect one's appearance was seen as a moral failing. Wealthy women changed their outfits multiple times a day, requiring the assistance of a lady's maid to navigate the intricacies of petticoats, bustles, and crinolines. They endured the pinch of too small shoes and the scrape of stiff collars, all in the name of presenting a pleasing picture to the world. The pressure to be beautiful even extended to the skin. Pale, translucent complexions were prized as a sign of delicacy and refinement, and women went to great lengths to avoid the sun's darkening rays. They swathed themselves in shawls and gloves and carried parasols to protect their lily-white skin. Some even resorted to dangerous cosmetics to achieve the desired look, smoothing lead-based powders onto their faces and eating chalk to maintain a sickly pallor. One woman who took this obsession with beauty to extremes was Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known to her adoring public as Sisi. Born into Bavarian royalty in 1837, Sisi was famed for her gorgeous waist-length chestnut hair, her porcelain skin, and her impossibly slender figure. She was seen as the ultimate embodiment of feminine beauty, and her image was fetishized throughout Europe. But behind closed doors, Sisi was a deeply troubled woman grappling with the pressures of her role. She was desperately unhappy in her marriage to Emperor Franz Joseph, and found the rigid etiquette of the Viennese court stifling. She coped by retreating into a world of punishing beauty rituals, exercising fanatically and eating barely enough to survive. Sisi spent hours each day tending to her hair and skin, applying secret concoctions made of crushed strawberries, raw veal, and lard. She laced her corset ever tighter, at one point achieving an astonishing 16-inch waist. And she pushed her body to the limit with long hikes and fencing sessions, even when pregnant or ill. To the outside world, Sisi was a fairy tale empress, a romantic heroine come to life. But in reality, she was a prisoner of her own myth, trapped by the very beauty that had made her famous. Her story is a tragic example of how the Victorian cult of femininity could consume a woman's life, reducing her to nothing more than a decorative object. And for most women, even achieving that level of ornamental status was an impossible dream. The vast majority of Victorian women were not wealthy aristocrats or royal empresses, but ordinary middle and working class ladies with few options in life. The respectable roles open to them were severely limited. They could become wives and mothers, or they could resign themselves to the lonely, pitied existence of the spinster. There were almost no opportunities for women to pursue higher education or meaningful careers. Even the most basic schooling was focused on creating proper young ladies, not scholars or professionals. Girls were taught feminine accomplishments like needlework, watercolor painting, and conversational French, rather than math or science. The ideal was a woman who could entertain guests in the drawing room and manage a household, not one with intellectual ambitions. A woman who dared to dream of a life beyond the domestic sphere faced an uphill battle. as the famous nurse Florence Nightingale discovered. Born to a wealthy British family in 1820, Florence was a bright and curious child who longed to make a difference in the world, but her aspirations of becoming a nurse were seen as shockingly improper for a lady of her class. Florence's parents refused to allow her to pursue medical training, believing it would ruin her marriage prospects. They expected her to settle down with a respectable husband and start a family, not traipse off to filthy hospitals to tend to strangers. But Florence was determined to follow her calling and eventually wore down her family's resistance. She endured grueling training in Germany, where she learned the latest techniques in hygiene and patient care. And when the Crimean War broke out in 1853, she leapt at the chance to put her skills to use. She travelled to the front lines with a team of 38 nurses and found conditions in the army hospitals appalling, filthy, overcrowded, and lacking in even the most basic supplies. Florence worked tirelessly to improve sanitation and nutrition, and to provide emotional comfort to the wounded soldiers. She became known as the Lady with the Lamp, making her rounds late into the night to check on her patients. Her efforts helped reduce the death rate in the hospitals by 2/3, and she returned to England a national heroine. But even with her newfound fame, Florence struggled to be taken seriously as a medical professional. Many male doctors resented her authority and questioned her methods, and she faced constant pushback from the military establishment. She eventually retreated into a life of seclusion, battling chronic illness and depression. Florence's story is a testament to the incredible strength and determination of Victorian women who fought against the odds to make their mark on the world. But for most, even the chance to fight those battles was out of reach. The pressure to conform, to fit the mold of the proper lady, was overwhelming and all-consuming. And nowhere was that pressure more apparent than in the rituals of courtship and marriage. For a Victorian woman, her wedding day was the culmination of years of careful preparation and strategic maneuvering, a make-or-break moment that would determine the course of the rest of her life. She was expected to marry well, to snag a husband who could provide for her financially and elevate her social standing. The process of finding that perfect mate was a complex and often humiliating one. Young women of marriageable age were trotted out at an endless series of balls, dances, and social gatherings, paraded before potential suitors like prize heifers at a county fair. They were expected to be charming, but chaste, witty, but not too clever, beautiful, but not vain. The slightest misstep could ruin a woman's reputation and her chances at a good match. She had to navigate the treacherous waters of flirtation and courtship without being seen as fast or improper. A wrong word, a misplaced glance, an accidental touch. Any of these could brand her as damaged goods in the eyes of society. For women who didn't fit the conventional mold of beauty, the marriage market could be a brutal and demoralizing experience. The writers Anne Thackeray and Mary Ann Evans, who wrote under the pseudonym George Eliot, both penned poignant sketches of the plight of the ugly duckling in Victorian society. In her essay, Toilers and Spinsters, Thackeray describes the superfluous women who are left on the shelf, doomed to a life of genteel poverty and social isolation. She writes of the pressure to be charming and marketable, and the crushing disappointment of being passed over for prettier, more vivacious girls. Evans, in her novel Middlemarch, creates a brilliant but plain heroine named Dorothea Brooke, who longs for a life of intellectual fulfillment. But she is pushed into a disastrous marriage with a much older man, her dreams of scholarly pursuits crushed under the weight of domestic duties. For the lucky women who did manage to secure a husband, their troubles were far from over. Marriage in Victorian England was a decidedly one-sided affair, with all the power and privilege granted to the male spouse. Under the legal doctrine of coverture, a married woman's identity was completely subsumed by her husband's. She became, in essence, his property, with no rights to her own body, her children, or her possessions. A woman was expected to submit to her husband's will in all things, even when it came to the most intimate aspects of her life. Marital assault was not recognized as a crime, and a man was seen as entitled to his wife's sexual favors whenever he desired. For women in abusive marriages, there was little recourse. Divorce was almost impossible to obtain and carried a heavy social stigma. The story of Caroline Norton, a beautiful and talented writer, illustrates the injustice of the Victorian marriage laws. Trapped in a miserable union with a violent drunkard, Caroline was denied access to her own earnings and barred from seeing her children when she finally left him. She channeled her grief and rage into a campaign to change the laws, writing passionate letters and pamphlets arguing for women's rights. Her efforts helped lead to the passage of the Custody of Infants Act in 1839, which gave mothers the right to petition for custody of their children under the age of 7. And her later work helped pave the way for the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, which made divorce more accessible and allowed women to keep their own property in a separation. But while Caroline's story had a relatively happy ending, for most Victorian women, marriage was a life sentence of drudgery and sacrifice. And the greatest sacrifice of all was often on the altar of motherhood. In an era without reliable birth control, married women faced the constant spectre of pregnancy, their bodies ravaged by the toll of bearing and burying child after child. Childbirth itself was a harrowing and dangerous ordeal, with no pain relief and often unsanitary conditions. Women routinely died in labour or from infections contracted during the birthing process. And even if they survived, they faced the heartbreak of losing their babies to disease, malnutrition, or simple bad luck. Queen Victoria herself was no stranger to the sorrows of motherhood. Though she famously adored her husband Prince Albert and took great joy in her 9 children, she also suffered devastating losses. Her second daughter, Princess Alice, died at the age of 35 from diphtheria contracted while nursing her own sick child. And her youngest son, Prince Leopold, was a haemophiliac who died at just 30 years old from a brain hemorrhage. In her letters and diaries, Victoria writes movingly of the anguish of outliving her children and of the burden of being a mother in an age of such precarity. She also struggled with the demands of royal motherhood, feeling constrained and overwhelmed by the constant pressure to produce heirs and manage a large household. For less privileged women, the strains of motherhood were even more acute. Working-class mothers had to balance childcare with grueling factory labour or domestic service, often leaving their infants in the care of older siblings or inexperienced neighbours. They returned to work mere days after giving birth, their bodies still raw and bleeding, because they could not afford to lose their jobs. And for those women who could not or did not want to have children, the stigma was intense. Spinsters were seen as failed women, their barrenness a mark of shame and inadequacy. They were often relegated to the margins of society, living on the charity of family members or scraping by as underpaid governesses or companions. The plight of the Victorian spinster is captured poignantly in the novel Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell. The book follows the lives of a group of unmarried women in a small English village, their days filled with the small dramas of tea parties and gossip. But beneath the surface, there is a deep sadness and sense of missed opportunity, a yearning for a life that has been denied to them. Gaskell herself knew the pain of being a single woman in Victorian society. She married relatively late in life at the age of 31 and had to endure years of pity and condescension from friends and family. And when her husband died just 6 years later, leaving her with 2 young daughters to support, she turned to writing as a means of survival. For Gaskell and other women writers of the period, literature was a way to explore the inner lives of women, to give voice to their struggles and their triumphs. But even in the world of the arts, women faced significant barriers and prejudices. They were seen as inferior to male writers, their work dismissed as sentimental or trivial. Many female authors, like the Bronte sisters and Mary Ann Evans, published under male pseudonyms to avoid the stigma of being a lady novelist. They knew that their writing would not be taken seriously if it was known to come from a woman's pen, and they feared the backlash that could come from stepping outside the narrow confines of feminine propriety. But despite the obstacles, Victorian women writers produced some of the most enduring and influential literature of the era. From the Gothic romances of the Brontes to the social realism of Gaskell and Eliot, their work challenged the prevailing stereotypes of women and explored the complex realities of their lives. And it wasn't just in literature that women were making their mark. In the realm of social reform, women like Florence Nightingale and Josephine Butler were fighting to improve the lives of the most vulnerable and marginalized members of society. Their efforts laid the groundwork for the women's suffrage movement and the broader fight for gender equality in the 20th century. But for most Victorian women, the struggle for self-determination was a quiet, personal one, waged in the confines of their own homes and hearts. They faced a world that was hostile to their dreams and desires, that sought to constrain them at every turn. And yet, they found ways to resist, to carve out small spaces of freedom and fulfillment in the face of overwhelming odds. In their diaries and letters, in their art and their activism, Victorian women left a legacy of resilience and courage that continues to inspire us today. Their stories remind us of the incredible progress that has been made in the fight for women's rights, and of the work that still remains to be done. As we look back on the Victorian era from the vantage point of the 21st century, it can be easy to feel a sense of superiority, to marvel at the backwards attitudes and oppressive customs of a bygone age. But we must also remember that the struggles of Victorian women are not so far removed from our own. Even today, women continue to face discrimination and violence, to be held to impossible standards of beauty and behaviour, to have their voices silenced and their experiences dismissed. The fight for true equality is an ongoing. As we've seen, life for Victorian women was marked by restriction, repression, and unrelenting demands. Even aristocratic women, despite their relative comfort and privilege, were still tightly confined to narrow domestic and social roles that gave them little room to pursue their own interests or ambitions. One such woman was Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known to her family as Sisi. Born into Bavarian royalty in 1837, the strikingly beautiful Elizabeth caught the eye of the young Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria when she was just 15. The two soon married, and overnight Elizabeth was thrust into the role of Empress, a position that came with immense pressure and scrutiny. As a young bride, Elizabeth struggled to adapt to the rigid etiquette and strict ceremonial routines of the Habsburg court. She chafed at the constant monitoring by attendants and resented the overbearing influence of her mother-in-law, Princess Sophie. Elizabeth sought solace in a zealous beauty regimen, spending hours each day tending to her ankle-length hair, pinched waist, and alabaster complexion. Over time, maintaining her renowned beauty became an obsession for the Empress. She wrapped herself in damp cloths at night to preserve her trim figure and subsisted on a diet of milk, eggs, and broth to keep her weight at a mere 110 pounds, despite her 5 feet 8 inches frame. Elizabeth spent hours every day exercising vigorously on rings and bars to maintain her slender build. As she withdrew further into her fixations, Elizabeth began to neglect her duties as wife and mother. She left her children for months at a time to travel compulsively across Europe and North Africa, always with an entourage of hairdressers, Greek tutors, and a personal gym in tow. Struggling with what some historians believe was depression and anorexia, she became increasingly eccentric and melancholic. Though Elizabeth resented the public fetishization of her appearance, she also relied on her beauty as a source of influence and independence in a court that granted her little official power. As she aged and her legendarily trim waist began to thicken, she only withdrew further from the public eye, hiding her figure behind fans, face veils, and parasols. In 1898, while walking along the promenade in Geneva, the 60-year-old empress was stabbed through the heart by an Italian anarchist. It's said that her corseted waist was so slim and the wound so small that at first no one noticed she had been injured. She collapsed and died moments later, a poignant symbol of the gilded cage in which she had spent her life. Elizabeth's tragic story illustrates the immense physical and emotional toll that the era's rigid feminine ideals took on women. Though she enjoyed all the comforts and privileges of her rank, she was still, in many ways, a prisoner of her celebrated beauty and the limited outlets permitted to women of her station. Of course, ordinary women without Elizabeth's resources had even fewer options for independence and self-expression. For the vast majority of Victorian women, there was really only one socially acceptable path: marriage. But as we'll see, even this came with its own set of suffocating constraints and indignities. The process of husband hunting was a complex and often humiliating ritual, marked by the pageantry of balls, calling cards, and afternoon teas. Well-bred young ladies were expected to navigate this delicate courtship dance under the hawkish eyes of chaperones, careful to follow the intricate, unspoken rules of propriety and flirtation. Those who went unmarried into their mid-20s risked being seen as undesirable old maids and faced increasing social isolation, as well as financial insecurity in a world with few respectable employment options for women. The pressure to find a husband of good social and economic standing was immense, as marriage was viewed as the defining achievement of a woman's life. This harsh reality is vividly captured in many novels of the era, populated by heroines who face dwindling marital prospects and social ostracization for the crime of being plain, poor, or overly intelligent. Authors like Anne Thackeray and Mary Ann Evans, who both struggled on the Victorian marriage market themselves, provide unsparing depictions of this punishing social ritual in their work. In her 1852 novel, The History of Henry Esmond, Thackeray paints a cutting portrait of the marriage market through the eyes of her eponymous hero. As a shy, bookish young woman without much of a dowry, the narrator ruefully observes the machinations of the London season, where cold calculation is cloaked in the language of romance. She watches wealthier, better-connected girls scheme to ensnare desirable husbands, while she and her fellow ugly ducklings are left to warm the chairs at dances, ignored by the marrying men. Without beauty, charm, or fortune to barter, she muses, an awkward young woman is a mere encumbrance which everyone is eager to be rid of. Mary Ann Evans, better known by her masculine pen name George Eliot, also drew on her own painful experiences as an unattractive woman in her work. Although her soaring intellect would eventually make her one of the most celebrated authors of the era. As a young woman, Evans keenly felt her exclusion from the marriage market. In a letter to a friend, she describes attending a London dance where she felt supremely uncomfortable and out of place among the fashionable throng. I had the consciousness that my attire and my self-possession were not up to the mark, she wrote, and I had no one to take me in hand and uphold my dignity. That sense of exposure and inadequacy is palpable in Eliot's depiction of Gwendolen Harleth, the ambitious but insecure heroine of her novel Daniel Deronda. Though beautiful and accomplished, Gwendolen is acutely aware that her lack of fortune puts her at a disadvantage in the battle for eligible bachelors. When a socially desirable suitor begins to court her, she agonizes over how to respond, torn between her yearning for independence and her fear of ending up a penniless spinster. No one who has not been in the position of a young woman looking for a rich husband can understand the depth of disgust and resistance she may feel, Eliot writes. capturing the quiet desperation of the marriage market. For women like Gwendolyn, Anne Thackeray's Wallflower, and countless real-life Victorian brides, the sought-after wedding day was not a romantic culmination, but a kind of surrender. In a world that offered women so few paths to security or self-determination, donning the wife's ring and veil often felt more like a trap than a triumph. And in fact, Victorian marriage could become a kind of gilded cage for many women, who found themselves legally and economically subsumed by their husbands. Under the doctrine of coverture, a married woman had no independent legal identity. She could not own property, control her own earnings, or even have guardianship over her children. For women unlucky enough to find themselves yoked to abusive or dissolute husbands, this complete legal dependence could spell disaster. With divorce prohibitively difficult and expensive to obtain, many wives simply had to endure mistreatment with no real recourse. One woman who took on the injustice of Victorian marital law was Caroline Norton, a society beauty and acclaimed author who found herself in a nightmare marriage. After her violent, vindictive husband George kicked her out and denied her access to her 3 young children, Norton discovered she had no legal right to see them. Incensed, she channeled her anguish into activism, becoming a vocal advocate for women's custodial rights. She penned impassioned pamphlets and open letters arguing that motherhood was a sacred duty that should not be subject to the whims of cruel or careless husbands. Norton's tireless campaigning helped push through the Custody of Infants Act in 1839, which gave mothers the right to petition for custody of their children up to the age of 7 and access thereafter. It was a groundbreaking first step in establishing women's parental rights, though true equality was still a long way off. Norton next set her sights on the question of women's property rights, another area where wives were utterly dependent on male beneficence. Under coverture, any wealth or property a woman brought into a marriage immediately became her husband's, to dispose of as he pleased. A wife had no right to her own inheritances or earnings, even if she was the sole breadwinner. This injustice was laid bare in Norton's own experience, when her estranged husband vindictively laid claim to the royalties from her successful books, leaving her unable to support herself and her children. "I was working for my bread, and the law takes my bread away from me," she wrote in fury. Again, Norton threw herself into the fight, lobbying MPs, writing articles, and gathering testimony from women who had been left destitute by feckless or greedy husbands. After years of dogged campaigning, her efforts bore fruit in the Married Women's Property Act of 1870, which granted wives limited control over their own earnings and inheritances. It was another crucial victory, though married women would not gain full property rights on par with men until 1882, 5 years after Norton's death. Her legacy, however, was sealed as one of the earliest and most effective advocates for Victorian women's legal and economic emancipation. Of course, the law was not the only force constraining women in marriage. The physical perils and indignities of constant childbearing also took an immense toll. In an age without reliable contraception or medically sound birthing practices, the Victorian feminine ideal of the angel in the house, the devoted, submissive, ever-nurturing wife and mother, placed enormous pressure on women to bear as many children as possible, even at the cost of their health and autonomy. With little understanding of women's reproductive systems and scant regard for their comfort, doctors routinely discouraged any attempt to limit family size. As a result, most married women spent their prime years in a state of almost constant pregnancy, birth, and nursing, their bodies never fully their own. Well into the late 19th century, the average woman could expect to bear 6 or 7 live children over the course of her fertile years, not counting miscarriages and stillbirths. Wealthier women were somewhat shielded from the most punishing physical aspects of motherhood by the labours of wet nurses and nannies. But for the majority of women, the sheer bodily strain of perpetual pregnancy, birth and breastfeeding could be debilitating even deadly. In an era before antibiotics, even routine birth carried a serious risk of life-threatening childbed fever, while complications like preeclampsia and obstructed labor could easily prove fatal without proper medical intervention. According to some estimates, maternal mortality ran as high as 15% in some crowded urban areas. Even for women who survived their pregnancies and births, the physical aftermath could be grim. Lacerations, infections, and the prolapsed organs associated with multiple vaginal deliveries were commonplace. So too was the pain of cracked nipples and mastitis from the relentless demands of nursing. For all the hallowed rhetoric venerating mothers, actual maternal care was often primitive and inadequate. Doctors, who were overwhelmingly male, tended to be dismissive of female complaints, chalking up everything from postpartum incontinence to crippling pelvic pain as the natural consequences of women's destiny. This casual disdain for women's suffering is epitomized by J. Marion Sims, the so-called father of modern gynecology, who performed gruesome experimental surgeries on enslaved African-American women without anesthesia or their consent in the mid-19th century. Sims, who believed that black women had a higher pain tolerance that made them ideal surgical specimens, invented the modern speculum through his grim work, but he thought nothing of the agony he inflicted on his powerless subjects, many of whom endured up to 30 operations to satisfy his curiosity. For Victorian women of all classes and colours then, the female body was in many ways a battleground, where male authority and feminine submission played out in stark, often brutal ways. Whether through the onslaught of endless pregnancies or the cold indifference of male physicians, women were constantly reminded of their second-class physical status. Perhaps no woman embodied this tension between idealized motherhood and punishing female reality more than Queen Victoria herself. Though she would lend her name to the era and in many ways defined its conservative feminine ideal, Victoria chafed at the loss of autonomy that came with the duties of wife and mother. Deeply in love with her husband, Prince Albert, Victoria nevertheless resented the way her treasured time with him was constantly interrupted by the demands of pregnancy and childbirth. Over the course of their 21-year marriage, she would bear 9 children, at one point spending over a decade continuously pregnant or nursing. In her diaries and letters, Victoria makes no secret of her distaste for the physical strain and indignities of childbearing. She describes her first pregnancy as a kind of living death, like a dog's existence, troubled with strange thoughts and desires, mewed up in a wretched cage. After a particularly grueling labour with her 8th child, during which doctors gave her chloroform against her wishes, the Queen raged in her diary, "What makes me most angry is that I am being forced to do this and that no one considers what it costs me to suffer so and be deprived of my husband's comfort." For Victoria, motherhood was a kind of paradox. She adored her children and felt a strong sense of maternal duty, but she also keenly felt the loss of self that came with the role. As a queen and a public figure, she was constantly on display, her pregnancies and postpartum periods fodder for gossip and scrutiny. After Albert's sudden death in 1861, Victoria fell into a deep depression that only compounded her ambivalence about motherhood. Overwhelmed by grief and the demands of ruling alone, she withdrew from her children, leaving them to the care of nannies and tutors for long stretches. Her relationship with her eldest son Bertie, who stood to inherit the throne, was especially fraught. Victoria alternately neglected and nitpicked the sensitive boy, frustrated that he could not live up to the impossible standard of his dead father. "You are not fit to succeed him," she cruelly told Bertie when he displeased her. In many ways, Victoria's struggles reflect the impossible bind of Victorian motherhood writ large. Women were expected to subsume their identities completely in their children, to find total fulfillment in the holy duties of nurturing and self-sacrifice. At the same time, they enjoyed little support or consideration for the very real physical and emotional costs of this all-consuming role. For working-class mothers who had no royal retinue to fall back on, this double burden was even more punishing. Many had no choice but to leave their infants with slapdash baby farms or older siblings while they laboured in factories and workshops, their meagre wages the only thing standing between their families and the poorhouse. These women faced the cruel irony of Victorian morality, which venerated the sanctity of motherhood while providing no social safety net for those who performed its most essential labour. Poor women who could not afford to stay home with their children were painted as neglectful and unnatural, even as their work outside the home was often the only thing keeping those children alive. For mothers who fell into sex work, the stigma and peril was even greater. Though prostitution was tacitly tolerated as a necessary evil to accommodate male desire, sex workers themselves were painted as irredeemable fallen women, their children presumed doomed to follow in their dissolute footsteps. In reality, of course, most Victorian prostitutes were driven into the trade by sheer economic desperation, not inborn depravity. With few respectable jobs available to unskilled women, selling sex was often the only way to keep body and soul together, especially for those burdened with hungry mouths to feed. One such woman was Sarah Hicks, a London prostitute who recorded her harrowing life story in an 1887 memoir. Orphaned at a young age and left with a baby brother to support, Hicks reluctantly turned to sex work as the only way to keep them both off the streets. In her telling, the life of a prostitute was one of constant danger, degradation, and physical suffering. Venereal disease was rampant among sex workers, who had little access to reliable treatment or prevention. Hicks describes the agony of syphilitic sores and the desperate measures women would resort to in an attempt to cure them, from mercury rubs to carbolic acid douches. Violence, too, was an ever-present threat in a world where men viewed prostitutes as disposable vessels for their basest urges. Hicks writes of being beaten, choked, and threatened with knives by rough clients, with no legal recourse or protection. A harlot has no rights, she observes bitterly. She is a creature to be used and abused at will. Perhaps most heartbreaking is Hicks' account of the toll her work took on her ability to mother her own child, born when she was just 17. Unable to afford childcare, she was forced to leave her infant son alone for long stretches while she worked the streets, his cries haunting her as she serviced men in filthy alleys and rented rooms. When her little boy fell ill with diphtheria, Hicks was unable to afford proper medical care or even take time off to nurse him. She describes her anguish at holding her wasted child as he gasped for breath, knowing that her only choice was to go back out and earn the money for his burial. "What kind of mother am I?" she weeps. Hicks's story is just one of. The grand homes and gardens of the Victorian upper class may stir images of opulent splendour, of elegant ladies swishing down marble staircases in voluminous gowns. But beneath the sumptuous fabrics and polished veneers, these women led far more constrained and uncomfortable lives than we might imagine from our modern vantage point. For starters, the layers upon layers of petticoats, crinolines, bustles, and corsets that made up a fashionable Victorian ladies' ensemble were a far cry from today's practical, washable garments. Corsets, in particular, were the defining undergarment of the era and the bane of many a Victorian woman's existence. Made of stiff fabric and boning from materials like steel or whalebone, corsets were designed to cinch a woman's waist into the smallest possible circumference while exaggerating her hips and bosom. The silhouette this created may have aligned with the hourglass ideal of feminine beauty at the time, but the garment itself was a bona fide torture device. Women were advised to start wearing corsets in childhood and to lace them tighter and tighter as they developed, in order to mold their bodies into the desired shape. Tight lacing could compress the internal organs, constrict breathing, and even cause the ribs to deform. Fainting, shortness of breath, and digestive problems were common complaints. Some doctors even warned that excessive pressure on the abdomen could cause the uterus to literally fall out of the body, a condition known as prolapse. Despite these dire health consequences, going without a corset was simply unthinkable for respectable Victorian ladies. A tightly cinched waist was considered the foundation of beauty, grace, and womanly virtue. Atop her corset, a Victorian woman would don a daunting array of underpinnings, including a chemise, drawers, and layer upon layer of starched petticoats to achieve the fashionable bell shape of her skirt. Over that would go an elaborate gown with puffed sleeves, flounces, ruching, and all manner of fussy embellishments. The skirts were so voluminous that women often had to turn sideways to pass through doorways, and they lived in fear that a sudden gust of wind might blow their skirts up and cause an embarrassing episode. Just imagine trying to sit down, climb stairs, or relieve yourself while wearing such a cumbersome get-up. Venturing outdoors presented a whole new set of sartorial challenges for Victorian ladies. A shawl alone was not sufficient outerwear. No, to go out and about, a woman needed gloves, a hat, a bonnet, and a mantle or cape. God forbid any part of her skin besides her face be exposed to the eyes of strangers. A Victorian lady's complexion was meant to be as pale and delicate as porcelain. Tanned skin was associated with the coarse and unsheltered life of the working class. Women went to great lengths to avoid the sun, and would even ingest chalk or vinegar to achieve an ivory pallor. Some skin-whitening cosmetics of the era contained nightshade, mercury, and lead, toxic substances that could cause paralysis, organ failure, and death. The pursuit of so-called beauty could take an ugly toll, and perhaps no one exemplified the perils of Victorian beauty standards more poignantly than Empress Elizabeth of Austria. Renowned as the loveliest woman in Europe, she was idolized far and wide for her porcelain complexion, impossibly small waist, an abundance of chestnut hair that supposedly reached her feet. But behind this exalted facade was an increasingly unhappy woman who was buckling under the pressure of her own beauty myth. Elizabeth, fondly known as Sisi, was born into Bavarian nobility in 1837 and enchanted the young Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph when she was just 15. After a whirlwind courtship, the two married when Sisi was only 16 years old, too young and naive to anticipate the glaring spotlight that would now be trained on her every move as empress. Naturally slender and famed for the length and thickness of her hair, she began a tortuous cycle of crash diets and extreme beauty routines to maintain this celebrated image as she aged and after multiple pregnancies. Sisi would spend hours every day having her ankle-length hair painstakingly dressed and braided by her team of stylists. When she travelled, she brought her own extra-long copper bathtub and would have her hair washed with a cocktail of cognac and egg yolks to make it shine. She stuck to a starvation diet, subsisting on little more than broth, meat juice, and the occasional glass of milk. She was also an obsessive exerciser, taking up fencing and leading her ladies-in-waiting on punishing hikes and hours-long horseback rides. All of these relentless beauty regimens began to take a physical and mental toll on Sisi. Her 16-inch corseted waist was so tiny that she frequently fainted from inability to draw a deep breath. She grew increasingly anxious and depressed, and would go to great lengths to avoid being seen in public, even missing important state occasions. She took to wearing leather masks during the day to guard her complexion, and would only allow herself to be painted and photographed from her good side. In a cruel twist of fate, Sisi's famous beauty would become her downfall. In 1898, the reclusive empress travelled to Geneva under an assumed name to avoid recognition. but an Italian anarchist who had been studying photographs of European royalty spotted her on the promenade and stabbed her with a sharpened nail file, piercing her heart. Unaware the seemingly minor injury was so grave, Sisi boarded a steamship where she soon lost consciousness and died a short while later. It was a tragic end for a woman who was admired for her physical perfection, but who suffered immensely under the weight of her own flawless image. Yet even for women who were not international celebrities, the Victorian obsession with a particular standard of feminine beauty took a steep toll. Attaining the coveted pale and dainty look meant a cloistered, indoor life with little physical exercise or activity, the very opposite of what we now know is required for physical and mental health. Donning layer upon layer of cumbersome clothing restricted freedom of movement and made even simple actions into a chore. And these were just the struggles faced by upper and middle-class women who could afford to devote themselves to such time-consuming and expensive beauty regimens in the first place. Working-class women were simultaneously shamed for their sun-weathered skin and indelicate figures, yet lacked the resources or the leisure to transform themselves into such ornamental ideals of femininity. Just as Victorian society was deeply stratified by class, so too was the pursuit of beauty largely dictated by a woman's economic status. The fashions may have changed with time, but the expectation that women should suffer for beauty has endured in its own way. How many of us have tottered in too high heels, squeezed into Spanx, or endured the sting of hot wax in service of some cultural ideal of feminine allure? Yet when we look back on the excruciating pains Victorian women went through to align with the beauty mores of their time, we can appreciate how far we've come, even as the fight continues for more inclusive and compassionate definitions of womanhood. The gruesome realities of female health in the Victorian era may have you feeling grateful for modern medicine. But at the time, most physicians were still woefully ignorant about women's bodies and health issues. Any malady a woman suffered, whether physical or psychological, was likely to be dismissed as hysteria. This catch-all diagnosis stemmed from the ancient Greek notion that a wandering uterus caused all manner of female illnesses. Even respected medical texts of the day espoused such unscientific ideas. It's no wonder that many Victorian women were reluctant to consult male doctors about intimate matters. Modesty was paramount, and disrobing for an exam would have felt scandalous. Most physicians had a poor understanding of the female anatomy anyway, having only studied it in theory. The tortuous-looking metal speculums of the day probably didn't help matters either. Women's normal biological functions were pathologized and little understood. Menstruation was seen as a debilitating condition that made women unfit for higher education or demanding careers. Menopausal women were pitied as dried-up crones or feared as unhinged madwomen. Pregnancy and childbirth themselves were treated like a 9-month malady. In the face of constant pregnancies, Victorian women went to desperate lengths to limit their family size. Unreliable folk methods of birth control, like withdrawal or the rhythm method, were common. Condoms existed, but were more often used in brothels than respectable bedrooms. Some women resorted to toxic douching solutions made with ingredients like lead, carbolic acid, or mercury. For a woman who found herself with an unwanted pregnancy, options were bleak. Abortion was illegal and could be punishable by life in prison. Some abortionists used grisly methods involving sharp instruments or toxic substances. Botched abortions could easily lead to hemorrhage, infection, or death. Still, many women felt they had no choice but to risk it. Even for a wanted pregnancy, the idea of confinement for childbirth was a source of dread. Women gave birth at home, sequestered in their chambers for weeks. Pain relief was limited, and labour practices were often more influenced by Victorian notions of propriety than by medical evidence. Modesty dictated that women labour in restrictive gowns and lie flat on their backs, making the process all the more difficult. Puerperal, or childbed fever, was the scourge of new mothers. We now know it's caused by streptococcal bacteria, but Victorian doctors often failed to wash their hands or properly clean instruments between patients. Overused forceps and tears from unassisted deliveries provided ample opportunity for infection to set in. Even in the best hospitals, maternal mortality rates were a horrifying 10 to 30%. One of the most egregious chapters in Victorian women's health came from a doctor who rose to great fame and fortune by preying on vulnerable women. James Marion Sims, the so-called father of gynecology, developed his groundbreaking surgical techniques by experimenting on enslaved black women. In the 1840s, Sims ran a makeshift hospital out of his Alabama slave quarters. There, he performed excruciatingly painful operations on at least 10 enslaved women. He was seeking a surgical cure for vesicovaginal fistula, a debilitating complication of prolonged labor. But he did so using enslaved women as unwilling, unconsenting test subjects. Sims claimed to be acting in his patients' interests, but his unethical practices betrayed his racist worldview. He operated without anesthesia, justified by the fallacy that black people did not feel pain. He also blatantly took advantage of the powerlessness of enslaved women. Even if they wanted to, they had no right to refuse his demands. Consent is not possible when someone is considered property. After years of barbaric trial and error, Sims did eventually pioneer a successful fistula repair. But it came at an awful human cost paid by the enslaved women he experimented on. Despite serious ethical questions, Sims returned to New York and built a flourishing women's hospital and medical practice. He eventually became president of the American Medical Association. The exploitation of disempowered women sadly crops up over and over again in the history of women's health. Victorian physicians were able to take shocking liberties with female patients who had little choice or recourse. Enslaved women, poor women, and any deemed mentally unfit were especially vulnerable to medical abuses. These stomach-churning tales cast a harsh light on Victorian medicine's ignorance and misogyny. Modern women's health is by no means perfect, but we can be grateful for major strides in knowledge, consent, and compassionate care. Grisly horrors inflicted on long-suffering Victorian women paved the way for crucial reforms and improved practices. Even as medical science and society progressed, an undercurrent of exploitation still pervaded. From unwanted sexual advances disguised as pelvic massage treatments to coerced sterilizations of marginalized women, echoes of Victorian medical misogyny persisted. Horrifying abuses like Sims' experiments occurred well into the 20th century too, with impoverished Black and Latina women as prime targets. We can't be complacent about how vulnerable women have been violated in the name of scientific progress. Even the world-changing advent of contraceptive pills came out of troublingly unethical trials on women in Puerto Rico in the 1950s. The spectre of the unscrupulous Victorian male doctor taking advantage of disempowered female patients has been hard to completely banish. But as difficult as these histories are to reckon with, they need to be confronted to address ongoing inequalities and abuses. Victorian women's lack of rights left them woefully unprotected from a host of indignities and dangers. With limited control over their bodies, finances, or futures, many women had to simply endure mistreatment in silence. But some brave individuals fought back against oppressive systems, planting the seeds of reform. One such woman was Josephine Butler, a passionate advocate for Victorian sex workers. Having witnessed firsthand the desperation of women driven to prostitution by poverty, she was moved to take action. Butler campaigned tirelessly to repeal the Contagious Diseases Acts of the 1860s. These discriminatory laws forced suspected prostitutes to undergo invasive internal exams and imprisoned them in lock hospitals if found to have venereal disease. To Victorian sensibilities, Butler was a scandalous firebrand for openly discussing sex work and sexually transmitted infections. She toured the country giving provocative public talks and publishing pamphlets with titles like "The Constitution Violated." Butler argued that the Contagious Diseases Acts deprived poor women of basic rights and treated them like criminals, while male clients went unpunished. Butler faced immense public hostility for her activism on behalf of fallen women, seen as the lowest of the low in Victorian society. She received death threats, and her meetings were often violently broken up by angry mobs. But Butler also shrewdly built alliances with other social movements, arguing that the Contagious Diseases Acts violated all women's hard-won rights of habeas corpus. If poor women suspected of prostitution could be plucked off the street and subjected to degrading exams against their will, were any women truly free and equal? Butler and her allies' message was controversial, but undeniably powerful. In 1886, they succeeded in getting the Contagious Diseases Acts repealed, a major victory for disempowered women. Though she didn't put it in these terms at the time, Butler struck an early blow for female bodily autonomy. Her conviction that even the most marginalized women deserved basic human rights was revolutionary for the time. The idea that women should have a voice in the laws and policies that governed their lives lies at the heart of the women's suffrage movement that was brewing at the time. Early Victorian feminists had advocated for women's rights in various forms throughout the mid-19th centuries, from Caroline Norton's fight to reform marital property laws, to Barbara Beaudecham's campaigns for women's access to education and professions. But the fight for the vote became a defining struggle that brought women's rights into the mainstream. As with any movement, there were tensions and differing visions for how women's suffrage would take shape. Millicent Fawcett favoured a moderate, step-by-step path to enfranchisement, focusing on proving women's respectability and fitness for civic participation. She helped secure important milestones like the right for women to vote in local elections and to attend university. On the other end of the spectrum, Emmeline Pankhurst took a more militant tack with her Women's Social and Political Union. Deeds, not words, was their rallying cry, as suffragettes chained themselves to government buildings, smashed windows, and went on hunger strikes in prison. These polarizing tactics kept women's suffrage in the headlines, but also provoked backlash. Divisions aside, both Fawcett's and Pankhurst's organisations were instrumental in making votes for women a defining political issue by the early 1900s. Their dedicated grassroots organising and relentless advocacy laid the groundwork for the momentous 1918 Representation of the People Act, which granted suffrage to British women over 30 who met certain property qualifications. A decade later, it was expanded to all women over 21 on equal terms with men. Securing the vote was the crowning achievement of the Victorian women's rights movement, even if it came after Queen Victoria's reign ended. It represented the culmination of a century of tireless activism by women who dreamed of a world of greater freedom and equality. From the first rumblings of organised feminism at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 to the endgame of suffrage, these bold Victorians helped women make incredible strides within a single long lifetime. Their legacy paved the way for waves of feminist movements to follow. Of course, the struggle for women's full equality was far from over. But the sheer grit, resilience, and righteous determination of Victorian women's rights crusaders was nothing short of awe-inspiring. Against immense structural odds and social resistance, they doggedly chipped away at the confines on women's lives. Looking back from our vantage point today, it's mind-boggling to fathom just how many fundamental rights Victorian women lacked. Rights we often take for granted. From a 21st century perspective, the limited sphere Victorian women were forced to inhabit is almost claustrophobic. Unable to pursue an education, own property, have custody of their children, or even walk down the street without a chaperone, women were forever kept in a state of dependence. Social expectations and ideals of femininity also placed women in a kind of psychological prison. The pressure to live up to unrealistic standards of purity, submissiveness, selflessness, and domestic perfection was immense. Having interests or ambitions outside the home was harshly discouraged. Even just feeling sexual desire or discontent with one's lot was stigmatized as unladylike and unwomanly. Is it any wonder some women felt stifled to the point of madness? Of course, life for Victorian men wasn't a walk in the park either. Rigid norms of masculinity hemmed them into narrow roles too. The weight of being the protector and provider came with its own pressures and left little room for vulnerability. And men of limited means and from oppressed groups faced many barriers to fulfillment and self-determination. But it's fair to say that overall, Victorian men had an upper hand that Victorian women did not. Men had full legal personhood, access to almost all domains of public life, control of the family finances, and a far wider range of socially acceptable paths open to them. An unmarried man might be pitied, but a never-wed woman was the subject of vicious scorn and ridicule. Men's vices were winked at, while women paid dearly for moral trespasses. Victorians justified this yawning gender inequality by claiming it was simply nature's way. Women, they argued, were biologically destined to be self-sacrificing angels of the house, not strong-willed public figures. How convenient that this ideology propped up a system in which men held all the cards. The fact that women had to fight so hard for basic rights gives the lie to the notion that their subjugation was inevitable. For some free-thinking Victorian women, this stifling world sparked them to rebel and dream of something different. They looked around at their society's constraints and said, no more. With the odds stacked against them, they took huge risks to resist convention and carve out uncharted paths. Their efforts, though often thwarted in their own time, bore fruit further down the line. They inched the needle toward a world with more room for women to realize their full potential. We can draw strength from the example of these pioneering Victorian women who had the courage to agitate for change before it was cool. When they experienced injustice, they didn't just accept it as their lot. They spoke out, got organized, and tirelessly worked to transform society. Their collective action paved the way for later feminist movements to build on. It puts things in perspective to realize just how much has changed in a relatively short span of time, historically speaking. Victorian patriarchy can feel almost cartoonishly overbearing to us now. But the fact that the whole edifice eventually crumbled is pretty incredible. It's a reminder that the status quo is not inevitable and that we shouldn't take our current freedoms for granted. Of course, we've still got a long way to go until we achieve the kind of world our feminist forebears dreamed of. The Victorian notion that women's primary role is in the domestic sphere still has a stubborn hold in many circles. Working mothers face the same impossible expectations of being impeccable homemakers and professionals. Women who deviate from feminine norms still face backlash and policing of their life choices. Misogyny has evolved new ways to undermine women's full dignity and autonomy. These days, it may take the form of online abuse, reproductive rights rollbacks, and subtler forms of discrimination. The spirit of Victorian paternalism proves hard to fully exorcise. So the struggle for women's liberation continues, even if the battleground looks different these days. We've come a long way from the suffocating world Victorian women inhabited, but we can't get complacent. Like those steadfast suffragettes, we've got to keep our eyes on the prize and tackle the battles of our time. Change is possible, and we owe it to ourselves and future generations to keep reaching for that freer, more equal world. As we come to the end of our immersive tour through the lives of Victorian women, I hope you're drifting off to sleep with a renewed sense of gratitude and perspective. The constraints Victorian women faced can seem almost incomprehensible to us now. The fact that so many women endured such restricted realities is a testament to their resilience. At the same time, Knowing that some bold women refused to simply accept their lot and agitated for change is pretty inspiring. They faced so much opposition, and yet they kept on pushing for a better world. Step by hard-won step, they helped transform society and unlock opportunities for the women who came after them. So as you settle deeper into drowsiness, take a moment to salute those unsung heroines of first-wave feminism. Their trials, tribulations, and tireless advocacy made so much that we now enjoy possible. The fact that you can drift off unburdened by Victorian restrictions is a pretty profound thing. Of course, we've still got our work cut out for us to keep dismantling the lingering legacy of misogyny. But for now, let the soft blanket of slumber envelop you, secure in the knowledge that you stand on the shoulders of giants. The road they built was anything but easy, but it made our present that much brighter. Sweet dreams, until next time we meet to explore the annals of history. For now, rest well, knowing that the arc of progress, while long, does bend towards justice, even if it requires losing a lot of sleep. Good night, and may your repose be all the more restorative for the hard-won rights Victorian women could only dream of. Turning now to the limited opportunities Victorian women faced outside the domestic sphere, it's hard to overstate just how few paths were open to women of this era besides marriage and motherhood. With very few exceptions, women were barred from pursuing higher education at universities or from entering professional careers. The idea of an unmarried woman supporting herself was practically unheard of. Spinsterhood was seen as a pitiable state, an undesirable last resort for women who had failed to achieve their sole purpose in life of marrying and bearing children. And yet, with so few other options available, many women did remain unmarried simply because they lacked other viable paths to take. For young women of the upper and middle classes, their education and training was focused almost entirely on acquiring feminine accomplishments to attract a husband. Rather than scholarly pursuits, women were expected to fill their time learning skills like needlework, watercolor painting, singing, playing piano, or conversing in French. All of this knowledge was for the purpose of making her a charming, socially graceful ornament in the drawing room, never for her own intellectual growth or fulfillment. Only a very few strong-willed women managed to break out of this stifling mold against all odds. The famous nurse Florence Nightingale, for example, struggled for years against her wealthy family's disapproval to pursue her calling in medicine. Born into a well-off upper-class British family in 1820, the young Florence chafed against the limited scope of activities deemed appropriate for a woman of her social standing. In her youth, Nightingale's family refused to support any career ambitions for her, expecting her to follow the conventional path of marrying well and presiding over a household. But Florence was determined to pursue nursing, a grueling, often dangerous profession that was considered the domain of working-class women. For years, her family resisted her efforts to train as a nurse, believing it to be a demeaning aspiration, unbefitting a respectable lady. But Nightingale would not be dissuaded from her purpose. She saw nursing as a divine calling and chafed against the stifling social expectations placed on her. In 1844, a desperate Florence wrote in a private note, "I craved for some regular occupation, for something worth doing instead of frittering time away on useless trifles." It wasn't until Nightingale was 31 years old that her family very reluctantly allowed her to travel to Germany to finally receive formal nursing training. Even then, they considered this a great shame to the family. But Florence threw herself into the intensive nurses' training, working punishing 12-hour days filled with hard menial labor. Her diligence and aptitude quickly set her apart. When the Crimean War broke out and the British were faced with shocking casualties, Nightingale assembled and led a team of 38 volunteer nurses to the front. Despite resistance from the military establishment, Nightingale's team set up barracks hospitals and vastly improved sanitary conditions and care for wounded soldiers. Nightingale's wartime work brought her fame and cemented her status as a pioneering figure in the field of nursing. Her dogged statistical record-keeping and passion for sanitary reforms saved countless lives. By the time she died in 1910 at the age of 90, her impact had transformed nursing into a respected profession. The Nightingale School of Nursing she established in London in 1860 was a groundbreaking professional training program for nurses. Though few women of her era achieved the same level of professional independence, Florence Nightingale's trailblazing career served as an inspiration for generations of women yearning to have a meaningful purpose outside the home. Her story is a powerful testament to what women could achieve when they doggedly resisted the suffocating constraints placed on them. But for the vast majority of Victorian women, such a self-directed path in life was simply an impossible dream. Most had little choice but to pin all their hopes on a good marriage, seeing it as their only chance at a secure and respectable life. From a young age, enormous pressure was placed on women to marry well for the sake of elevating or maintaining their family status. Courtship and husband hunting in the Victorian era was a deadly serious business, far removed from our modern ideals of marrying for love. For women, the success or failure of their efforts on the marriage market would determine the entire course of the rest of their lives. An advantageous match could bring wealth, status, and comfort. Failure to secure a husband, on the other hand, would doom a woman to the social disgrace and penury of spinsterhood. The process of landing a husband was a complex and often humiliating one for Victorian women. Invitation-only balls were the primary venue for meeting and vetting potential spouses, with various arcane rituals and codes governing every interaction. An interested suitor had to call upon the lady he was pursuing during designated visiting hours, making tedious chit-chat in the parlour under the watchful eyes of a chaperone. Only after this awkward courtship ritual progressed to a certain point could a couple consider themselves engaged to be engaged. Even then, broken engagements were considered highly scandalous and could stain a woman's reputation for the rest of her life. In all of these carefully choreographed proceedings, sincere affection was rarely a top consideration. A man's wealth, social standing, and earning potential were the primary criteria on which women had to assess a potential spouse. The pressures and pitfalls of this cold, calculating marriage market culture were bitingly captured by female writers of the era. Anne Thackeray Ritchie, the daughter of famed Victorian novelist William Makepeace Thackeray, catalogued her disgust with the marriage market in an 1870s magazine essay called Toilers and Spinsters. An ugly duckling herself, the plain-looking Anne never married and was often rudely pitied as a spinster. She channeled her frustrations into defending spinsterhood as a valid path and decrying the way women were auctioned off to the highest bidder. Poor little brides, she wrote cynically of the young women around her. They look forward and are not afraid. It is the old story of the flies and the honey pot. Celebrated Victorian novelist Mary Ann Evans published under the male pen name George Eliot to avoid being pigeonholed as a frivolous lady writer. Her sweeping books often centered complex female characters who defied convention, like the doomed Maggie Tulliver of The Mill on the Floss and the strong-willed Dorothea Brooke in Middlemarch. In both her life and work, Evans pushed back against the constraints placed on Victorian women, shunning marriage and engaging in a scandalous live-in romantic relationship with a man who was unable to divorce his wife. Her nuanced depictions of women's struggles to assert their independence in a patriarchal society still resonate with modern readers today. The fact remains, however, that the paths taken by trailblazers like Florence Nightingale and George Eliot were vanishingly rare in Victorian times. For the vast majority of women, conforming to the social expectations of marriage was a matter of survival, not choice. Even the small taste of freedom and romance a woman might experience during courtship quickly gave way to the grim legal realities of coverture after marriage. Under the doctrine of coverture, a married woman essentially became a non-entity in the eyes of the law. Her very identity was considered covered by her husband's, meaning she could not own property, control her own earnings, or have any legal rights over her children. Anything a woman brought into the marriage became solely her husband's property. In fact, legally the husband and wife were considered a single entity, with the husband firmly at the head. The effects of coverture meant that married Victorian women were utterly at the mercy of their husbands, for better or worse. If a husband turned out to be abusive or profligate, his wife had virtually no legal recourse to protect herself or her children. She could not divorce him without proof of extraordinary mistreatment, and even if she did manage to obtain a divorce, she would be left without any property or means to support herself. Women trapped in unhappy or abusive marriages often simply had to endure their mistreatment in silence, as making a fuss would only jeopardize their social position further. The deep injustice of coverture left countless women vulnerable to exploitation with no way out. One particularly egregious case was that of Caroline Norton, a 19th century author and socialite who found herself trapped in a hellish marriage to a violent, drunken husband. After years of abuse, Caroline left her husband in 1836, taking their young children with her. In retaliation, her husband sued her close friend, Lord Melbourne, the Whig Prime Minister, for criminal conversation, essentially accusing them of having an affair. The scandalous criminal conversation trial that followed was the talk of London, with Caroline's reputation dragged through the mud. Though Lord Melbourne was acquitted, Caroline's husband continued to prevent her from seeing her children, using them as pawns to punish her for leaving him. Under coverture, Caroline had no legal rights to visitation or custody whatsoever. Her husband even had the right to seize all of Caroline's earnings from her writing. Determined to fight this injustice, Caroline Norton spent years tirelessly campaigning for legal reforms to protect women and grant them rights independent of their husbands. Her dogged efforts directly led to the passage of the Custody of Infants Act in 1839, the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, and the Married Women's Property Act of 1870, the first major cracks in the institution of coverture. Still, change was slow and piecemeal. Full legal equality was still a distant dream. In the meantime, Victorian women had little choice but to accept the grim realities of marriage as simply their lot in life. And once wed, the taxing cycles of pregnancy, childbirth, and motherhood that followed brought their own daunting hardships and sorrows. In an era without reliable contraception, many Victorian wives found themselves perpetually pregnant, their bodies ceaselessly strained by the rigors of carrying, birthing, and nursing one child after another. This constant physical burden was compounded by the emotional toll of losing children in an era plagued by high infant mortality rates. As many as 1 in 4 Victorian infants didn't survive to their first birthday, succumbing to common killers like infectious disease, diarrhea, and dehydration. Childhood mortality remained high even beyond infancy, with diseases like measles, scarlet fever, rubella, and whooping cough sweeping away countless young lives. Most Victorian mothers expected to lose at least one child. Maternal mortality in childbirth was also staggeringly common by modern standards. Puerperal fever, or childbed fever, was the leading cause of maternal death, a devastating infectious disease spread by doctors going from one labouring mother to the next without disinfecting their hands. It wasn't until the late 1800s that the importance of sanitation and hand-washing in preventing puerperal fever was widely accepted. In the absence of modern obstetric knowledge, the process of childbirth itself was a much more prolonged and excruciating ordeal. Without any real pain relief, besides swigs of liquor, and little understanding of how to handle complications like eclampsia or obstructed labour, women often laboured in agony for days on end. It's estimated that between 5 to 25 women died for every 1,000 births throughout the Victorian period. Even Queen Victoria herself, whose name has become synonymous with the era, was not untouched by these harsh realities of motherhood. Though she and Prince Albert were famously besotted with one another, Victoria dreaded being, in her words, like a cow or a dog, constantly pregnant. Over the course of 17 years, Victoria gave birth to 9 children. She loathed the physical miseries of pregnancy and the excruciating sufferings of childbirth. During her first labour with Princess Vicky, the ordeal lasted over 50 hours. The Queen was given chloroform to ease her pain for subsequent births and swore by it. Victoria also endured the shattering grief of losing children. Her second daughter, Princess Alice, died of diphtheria at age 35 in 1878, leaving behind a husband and young children. Her youngest son, Prince Leopold, was a haemophiliac who died at 30 following a fall, devastating the Queen. Of Victoria's own childhood, she wrote tellingly, "What a dreadful, dreadful loss to me that my dearest and kindest father should be taken, when I had hoped he might have lived many, many years longer. It is one of my greatest sorrows that my children have never or barely known a grandfather." So even at the very height of privilege, Victorian women were not spared the physical burdens and emotional pain that came with the feminine duty of bearing children at any cost. Lower down the social ladder, these hardships of constant childbearing were compounded by grinding poverty and backbreaking physical toil. Working-class women, of course, did not have the luxury of being sheltered in the domestic sphere, but were required to be wage earners, as well as wives and mothers. They worked punishing hours in factories and mills, or toiled as house servants, cooks and laundresses in wealthy homes. For working-class wives, the double shift of hired labour during the day and domestic labour at night was gruelling. The absolute bottom rung of Victorian society was occupied by those fallen women who resorted to prostitution to scrape out a living. Universally spurned as immoral and ruined, these women had often turned to sex work as a last resort, after being seduced and abandoned by a partner, left widowed with children to support, or orphaned and destitute. The term prostitute encompassed women working in high-end brothels, patronised by gentlemen, as well as those soliciting on the streets. Streetwalkers in particular faced wretched conditions, enduring abject poverty, venereal disease, violence, and exploitation with no recourse. The scourge of syphilis was especially devastating in a time before antibiotics, starting with painless sores, but leading to horrific outcomes like skin ulcers, blindness, dementia, and death. One rare first-hand account of Victorian prostitutes' lives comes from a woman writing under the pseudonym Another Unfortunate, who penned an 1859 letter to the Times from the London Oakham Shed. This small prison workroom was where arrested prostitutes picked apart old ropes to reuse the fibres. Another Unfortunate wrote of the miseries of a prostitute's life, plagued by disease, alcoholism, and the abuse of cruel clients. She describes the women jailed with her as poor, degraded dolls of the vilest and most depraved appetites, trying to drown their misery and shame in drink. But even these so-called vicious, depraved wretches, she argues, are worthy of compassion and help to escape their suffering. Such impassioned defences of fallen women were highly scandalous for the time, as prostitution was seen as a moral scourge enabling male vice. There was little mainstream sympathy for the desperate circumstances that drove women into sex work in the first place. But a few intrepid Victorian women made it their mission to offer help and hope to their unfortunate sisters, rather than condemnation. Foremost among them was the formidable Josephine Butler, a tireless campaigner for women's rights and dignity. Born into a wealthy family of social reformers and activists, Josephine was radicalized in her mission by a chance encounter with a destitute woman one night in 1860. She stopped to speak to the unhappy drunkard and was moved to tears by the woman's tale of being driven into prostitution by poverty and mistreatment. This experience lit a fire in Josephine to devote her life to helping such shunned and exploited women. She worked to open shelters and hostels to give vulnerable women a safe haven, and became a vocal advocate for their humane treatment. Josephine is best remembered for her unrelenting 16-year campaign to repeal the Contagious Diseases Acts of the 1860s. These cruel laws permitted and encouraged police to invasively inspect prostitutes for venereal disease. Women found to be infected could be forcibly treated in lock hospitals. Josephine saw the CD Acts as unjustly criminalizing women while sanctioning male licentiousness. Her crusade united Victorian feminists, putting women's bodily autonomy and sexual double standards at the center of the battle for gender equality. Josephine's hard-won victory in overturning the CD Acts in 1886 was a landmark moment for the growing women's rights movement. The late Victorian era saw the rise of many such trailblazing women who fought to expand the rights and opportunities available to their sisters. Another of the most prominent was Millicent Fawcett, who led Britain's largest women's suffrage organisation for over 20 years. Millicent firmly believed in achieving women's right to vote through constitutional, lawful means. Her moderate suffragist approach was focused on collecting signatures, lobbying politicians, and reasoned debate. She distanced her movement from the more militant suffragette actions of Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters. Emmeline Pankhurst, in contrast, believed that the only way to achieve votes for women was by any means necessary, including dramatic civil disobedience, window smashing, and hunger strikes. She and her Women's Social and Political Union became increasingly combative and radical in their tactics. While Millicent achieved a landmark victory with the passage of the Representation of the People Act in 1918, granting some women over 30 the vote, it wasn't until Emmeline's death in 1928 that all British women over 21. As the Victorian era progressed, some bold women began to openly challenge the status quo and demand change. They recognized the many injustices and challenges faced by women in this time and resolved to do something about it, even in the face of fierce opposition and resistance from a deeply patriarchal society. One such pioneering activist was Josephine Butler. Born into a progressive family in 1828, Butler had an early awareness of social issues and a passion for reform. She was particularly concerned about the plight of prostitutes and sexually exploited women. In Victorian England, rather than address the root causes that drove many unfortunate women to prostitution in the first place, society viewed these fallen women with contempt and blame. Butler was appalled by a series of laws passed in the 1860s, known as the Contagious Diseases Acts. These laws were ostensibly aimed at controlling the spread of venereal diseases, especially in port and garrison towns where prostitution was rampant. However, the laws took an outrageously discriminatory and punitive approach. They allowed police to arrest any woman they merely suspected of being a prostitute and force her to submit to an invasive and humiliating medical examination. If she was found to have a venereal disease, she could be essentially imprisoned in a lock hospital until cured. Men, on the other hand, were not targeted at all by these laws, even though they were just as likely to contract and spread sexual diseases as their female partners. The Contagious Diseases Acts made it glaringly obvious that Victorian society placed the burden of sexual purity and punishment squarely on women's shoulders. Josephine Butler found these laws abhorrent and made it her life's mission to have them repealed. She travelled the country, giving powerful speeches and gathering signatures for petitions against the acts. In one formidable feat of endurance, she collected 2,000 signatures in just 10 days. Butler also publicly named and shamed the male members of Parliament, who privately used the services of prostitutes while self-righteously upholding these unjust laws. she published harrowing first-hand accounts from women who had endured the degradation and trauma of these invasive exams. Ultimately, after years of tireless campaigning by Butler and her supporters, Parliament bowed to pressure and the Contagious Diseases Acts were repealed in 1886. While this was an important victory, Josephine Butler knew there was still so much work to be done to improve the lives of all women. She became a strong advocate for women's suffrage, arguing that women needed the power of the vote to protect their interests and influence the laws that govern their lives. Indeed, the fight for women's right to vote was picking up steam by the end of the Victorian era. Two other prominent reformers, Millicent Fawcett and Emmeline Pankhurst, were leading the charge, although they favoured different tactics. Millicent Fawcett believed in peaceful, law-abiding protests to slowly persuade politicians and society that women deserved the vote. Her organisation, the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, focused on lobbying Parliament and changing minds through reason and discussion. Emmeline Pankhurst, on the other hand, took a more militant approach with her group, the Women's Social and Political Union. Pankhurst and her followers believed that women had been patient and polite long enough. They were willing to resort to more controversial and confrontational tactics to make themselves heard, like chaining themselves to railings, smashing windows, and going on hunger strikes when they were arrested. The suffragettes, as they came to be known, endured ridicule, violence, and even imprisonment for their daring civil disobedience. When they went on hunger strikes in prison, they were often subjected to brutal force feedings that left many with permanent injuries. But Pankhurst and her dedicated activists would not be deterred. They were determined to show that they would rather die than continue to live without a voice and equal rights. Slowly but surely, public opinion began to turn in favour of women's suffrage. More and more men and women recognised the blatant unfairness and logical inconsistency of denying half the population a say in the laws that governed them. However, it would still be a long, arduous road, and Victorian suffragists like Fawcett and Pankhurst would not live to see their ultimate goal realised. Women in Britain over the age of 30 did not gain the right to vote until 1918, and it took another decade for full voting equality to be achieved in 1928. Nonetheless, the tireless efforts of Victorian activists like Butler, Fawcett, Pankhurst, and countless others laid the crucial groundwork that made future victories possible. They endured ridicule, harassment, and hardship to boldly imagine and demand a better world for women. As we reflect back on the many challenges and injustices faced by Victorian women, it can be easy to feel disheartened. Their lives were indeed constrained and difficult in so many ways, defined by suffocating societal expectations, crushing legal disadvantages, and discrimination at every turn. It took tremendous strength and resilience to simply survive as a woman in this time, let alone to dare to challenge the status quo as trailblazing activists did. At the same time, learning about these women's struggles can also be a source of inspiration and perspective. Victorian women may not have had the rights and freedoms that many of us take for granted today, but they still found ways to cope, to persevere, and to carve out what happiness and fulfillment they could within their difficult circumstances. And some of them had the vision and courage to stand up and fight for something better, even against seemingly impossible odds. When we remember what our foremothers had to endure, it puts our own challenges and privileges into clearer focus. We can recognise how far we've come, while also seeing how far we still have to go to achieve true equality and justice for women around the world. The victories we've achieved were built on the pain, sacrifices, and tireless efforts of generations of women who came before us. So while the lives of Victorian women were undoubtedly brutal in many ways, their stories are not merely tragic. There is something deeply heartening about their resilience, resourcefulness, and unquenchable thirst for fairness and dignity in the face of unrelenting hardship. They sowed the seeds of change through their suffering and their resistance. As we strive to shape a better, more equitable world for all, we can take strength and inspiration from the dauntless spirits of our sisters from the past. Their deeds and dreams live on through us. As we've seen, women in Victorian England were expected to conform to strict ideals of femininity and domesticity, with little room for individuality or independence. But within these stifling confines, some trailblazing women fought to expand the opportunities and rights available to their sex. One of the earliest battlegrounds was education. For most of the Victorian era, higher learning was considered the exclusive domain of men. The few women's colleges that existed were seen more as finishing schools, intended to polish ladies' accomplishments rather than truly expand their minds. But a few bold reformers sought to change that. One such pioneer was Emily Davies, a passionate advocate for women's equal education. In 1869, she helped found Girton College, the first residential college for women in England. Despite opposition from many who believed education would make women unfit for marriage and motherhood, Davies insisted that women deserved the same intellectual cultivation as men. Her efforts paved the way for other women's colleges, and slowly but surely, the idea that women could be serious scholars gained acceptance. By the end of the century, women were permitted to take Oxford and Cambridge exams, although they weren't yet granted degrees. It would take until 1920 and 1947, respectively, for those two elite universities to fully open their doors to women. Progress was slow and hard-won, but each small victory chipped away at the entrenched belief that women's minds were inferior to men's. Pioneers like Emily Davies endured ridicule and resistance to blaze a trail for the generations of female students and scholars that would follow. Another woman who made groundbreaking strides for Victorian women was Barbara Bodichon. Born into a wealthy and liberal-minded family, Bodichon used her privilege to advocate tirelessly for women's rights. One of her earliest causes was the reform of England's convoluted and discriminatory marriage laws. Under the doctrine of coverture, a woman's legal identity was subsumed into her husband's upon marriage. She had no right to own property, enter into contracts, or even retain custody of her own children. If a marriage turned abusive, women had little recourse. Incensed by these injustices, Bodichon published an influential pamphlet called A Brief Summary of the Laws of England Concerning Women. In it, she methodically laid out the ways in which the legal system failed women and made a compelling case for reform. Along with her contemporaries, Mary Howitt and Bessie Rayner Parkes, Bodichon also helped establish the English Woman's Journal, a groundbreaking publication that discussed women's issues and argued for their equal treatment under the law. The magazine was instrumental in raising awareness of the burgeoning women's rights movement. Bodichon's tireless campaigning helped lead to the passage of the Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882. While they didn't achieve full legal equality, these laws finally allowed married women to own their own property and keep their own earnings. It was a significant step forward in an era when women were still largely considered the property of their husbands. But the fight for women's rights still had a long way to go. Even as some reformers made strides in education and the law, the deep-seated belief that women were fundamentally inferior to men continued to limit their opportunities in profound ways. Victorian women were shut out of most professions, with a few exceptions like teaching and nursing. Even then, they were expected to give up their careers upon marriage. The idea of a married woman working outside the home was still hugely scandalous, but some intrepid women forged ahead anyway, determined to prove that they were just as capable as men. One of the most famous examples was Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, who became the first woman to qualify as a doctor in Britain. Born in 1836, Anderson was inspired to pursue medicine after meeting Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman to earn a medical degree in America. But when Anderson tried to enroll in medical school herself, she found that no universities were willing to admit a woman. Undeterred, Anderson studied privately with physicians and snuck into medical lectures intended only for men. She faced enormous resistance and ridicule from the male medical establishment, but eventually she was able to earn her license through a loophole with the Society of Apothecaries. Anderson went on to have a long and trailblazing career, opening her own practice and later a hospital for women staffed entirely by female physicians. At a time when women were still largely barred from the medical field, Anderson proved that they could be every bit as skilled and competent as male doctors. Still, Anderson's hard-won success was the exception rather than the rule. For most Victorian women, the idea of having a fulfilling career outside of the home remained an impossible dream. The same was true of the right to vote. As the 19th century drew to a close, women in England still lacked any voice in their country's politics. The idea of women's suffrage was hugely controversial, with many arguing that women were too emotional and irrational to be entrusted with the vote. But a growing movement of bold suffragists begged to differ. They argued that women deserved equal rights and representation, and they were willing to fight tooth and nail to achieve it. One of the most famous leaders of the suffragist cause was Emmeline Pankhurst, who founded the Women's Social and Political Union in 1903. Pankhurst and her fellow suffragettes staged rallies, marches, and demonstrations to demand the vote. They endured arrests, hunger strikes, and brutal force feedings in prison, all in the name of their cause. Pankhurst's daughter Christabel was also a key figure in the movement, organising attention-grabbing stunts like chaining herself to the railings outside Parliament. These militant tactics kept the issue of women's suffrage squarely in the public eye, even as many decried the suffragettes as unladylike and even dangerous. But their relentless efforts helped keep up the pressure for change. Slowly but surely, public opinion began to shift in favour of women's voting rights. The horrific force feedings endured by imprisoned suffragettes turned sympathies their way, and the service of women in World War I further proved their contributions to society. Finally, in 1918, the Representation of the People Act granted property-owning British women over the age of 30 the right to vote. It would take another decade for full voting equality to be achieved, but it was a monumental step forward after so many years of struggle. The road to women's rights in Victorian England and beyond was long and arduous. Change came slowly, with each small step forward hard-won by the blood, sweat, and tears of dedicated activists. Women like Emily Davies, Barbara Bodichon, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, and Emmeline Pankhurst endured everything from mockery to assault to imprisonment in their quest for a fairer, more equal world. The rigid gender roles and restrictions of Victorian society may seem almost unimaginable to us now. The idea that women were unfit for education, careers, or basic legal rights is absurd to most modern minds. But it's thanks to the tireless work of the pioneering women we've discussed that those notions ultimately crumbled away. So, as you drift off to sleep, take a moment to appreciate how far women have come and the incredible courage it took to get there. The cozy comfort of your bed may seem worlds away from the grim realities of Victorian womanhood, but it's only because of the passion and perseverance of generations of remarkable women that you can take your freedoms for granted. These women's stories may make for soporific listening now, but in their day, they were nothing short of revolutionary. Their quiet strength in the face of overwhelming odds helped build the world we know today, a world where women can learn, work, vote, and live independently as never before. That progress is still ongoing, with battles left to fight and glass ceilings waiting to be shattered. But each night, as we lay down our heads, we can draw inspiration from the dauntless spirits of the women who came before us and made our current lives possible. In the face of seemingly insurmountable resistance, they never lost sight of the dream of true equality. So let their determination soothe you into slumber, secure in the knowledge that however bleak circumstances may seem, there will always be those who stand up and fight for what's right. With activists like those we've profiled guiding our history, even the most stifling of societies can change and grow. So rest easy and awaken tomorrow to a world made that much brighter by the courageous women of our past. As the Victorian era drew to a close, the seeds of change that had been planted by trailblazing women began to take root. The fight for women's suffrage in particular gained momentum in the early 20th century. Millicent Fawcett, a prominent suffragist, believed in peaceful constitutional methods to achieve the vote. She founded the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies and worked tirelessly to lobby Parliament and change public opinion. In contrast, Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters favoured a more militant approach. They founded the Women's Social and Political Union, whose members became known as suffragettes. The suffragettes engaged in civil disobedience, property destruction, and hunger strikes to draw attention to their cause. Many were arrested and force-fed in prison, becoming martyrs for the movement. Though their tactics were controversial, the suffragettes played a crucial role in keeping women's suffrage in the spotlight. World War I proved to be a turning point in the fight for women's rights. With so many men away at war, women took on new roles in the workforce and public sphere. They worked in factories, drove ambulances, and served as nurses on the front lines. Their invaluable contributions challenged traditional notions of women's capabilities and their place in society. In 1918, in recognition of their wartime efforts, women over 30 were finally granted the right to vote in Britain. It was a hard-fought victory, though the age restrictions still limited the electorate. It would take another decade for women to achieve full voting equality with men. Nonetheless, the Victorian women who had fought so fiercely for their rights laid the groundwork for this momentous change. As we reflect on the lives of Victorian women, it's easy to feel grateful for the progress that has been made. We now live in a world where women have the right to vote, to own property, to pursue education and careers. The rigid gender roles and oppressive expectations of the Victorian era have largely faded away. Yet, it's important to remember that the fight for true gender equality is far from over. Even today, women continue to face discrimination, harassment, and violence simply because of their gender. The pay gap persists, and women are still underrepresented in positions of power. In many parts of the world, girls are denied access to education and subjected to horrific practices like child marriage and female genital mutilation. The Victorian women we've encountered in this series, the activists, the writers, the pioneers, remind us that change is possible, but it requires courage, persistence, and solidarity. They fought against incredible odds to chip away at the patriarchal structures that confine them. Their stories are a testament to the resilience and strength of women throughout history. As we come to the end of our journey through the Victorian era, I invite you to reflect on the incredible progress that has been made and the work that still lies ahead. The fight for gender equality is a relay race passed down from generation to generation. It's up to all of us, women and men alike, to continue the work of building a more just and equitable world. And with that, dear listener, we come to the end of our bedtime story. I hope that learning about the lives of Victorian women has been an enlightening and thought-provoking experience, even as it lulled you into a restful slumber. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel for more soothing historical content to ease you into sleep. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Good night and sweet dreams.